Hello, and welcome back to the Cognitive Revolution. Today, I'm excited to share my conversation with Cameron Berg, Research Director at AE Studio, whose vision for mutualism between humans and AIs constitutes one of the most compelling positive visions for the AI future that I've heard, and whose recent research into the situations in which frontier AI systems report having subjective experiences is one of the very best scientific inquiries into the possibility of AI consciousness that I've seen, and which demonstrates that hypotheses motivated by ideas from philosophy and cognitive science and tested with thoughtfully designed experiments can produce powerful results without requiring a crazy heavy technical lift. Regular listeners may remember AE Studio and their neglected approaches approach from our earlier episode with CEO Judd Rosenblatt and R&D Director Mike Viana on self-other overlap, a really creative alignment strategy that reduces the risk of deception and other adverse behaviors by minimizing the difference in the internal states that a model uses to represent situations and propositions involving itself as compared to those involving others. About that work, Eliezer Yudkowsky said, quote, "I do not think superalignment is possible in practice to our civilization, but if it were, it would come out of research lines more like this than like RLHF." And in all seriousness, while everyone, including Cameron, remains radically uncertain about the reality of AI consciousness, I think this work is similarly important. So, what exactly did they do? Starting with the observation that many of today's leading theories of consciousness emphasize the importance of self-referential processing, Cameron and co-authors tested whether prompts designed to induce self-referential processing would cause frontier language models to report subjective experience. Remarkably, when prompted this way, models from Anthropic, OpenAI, and Google do consistently report having experiences. That's interesting, but the truly striking result comes from a mechanistic study that the team performed on Llama 3.370B using the sparse autoencoder APIs provided by the Goodfire platform. The team identified features related to deception and roleplay, and found that reducing deception by suppressing these features makes the model more likely to report consciousness, while increasing deception by amplifying them produces the standard "I'm just an AI" response. In other words, and this interpretation is supported by validation of the technique on the Truthful QA benchmark, modifying AI internals to promote truth-telling makes them more likely to say that they are in fact conscious. What should we make of this? Cameron is not jumping to any conclusions, but for calibration, in a September blog post, Scott Alexander wrote that while he finds that most discussion of AI consciousness amounts to, quote, shouting priors at each other, this sort of, quote, mechanistic interpretability-based lie detection is, quote, the only exception, the single piece of evidence I will accept as genuinely bearing on the problem. For my part, while I've always been very uncertain and open-minded about AI consciousness, these results do push me toward taking the possibility more seriously. And more importantly, while it seems plausible that we may never get much more compelling evidence than this, the uncertainty itself recommends a precautionary approach. Humans, it is worth remembering, have repeatedly justified grave moral errors by denying the consciousness and moral standing of other humans and animals. And as Cameron memorably puts it, I wouldn't want to create something more powerful than us that has reason to see us as a threat. With that, I hope you find this conversation about applying the scientific method to the possibility of AI consciousness and the need for two-way human-AI alignment as arresting and thought-provoking as I did. This is Cameron Berg of AE Studio. Cameron Berg, Research Director at AE Studio. Welcome to the Cognitive Revolution.
Thanks for having me, Nathan. I'm really excited to talk today.
Me too. I think you have some really fascinating work that we're going to dive very deeply into. And I think it's, won't spoil it immediately, but it's going to be very thought-provoking, I think, for a lot of people, and hopefully will stir up some good trouble and good conversation. Just to set the stage, I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on the general vibe. So we met at the Curve not long ago, 2 weeks ago, and it was an outstanding event. Lots of people posted their reflections about it. Lots of influential people there. Jack Clark gave a great closing keynote, and I thought his keynote kind of captured the general vibe that I had at the event, and more importantly, like the general vibe that I have about AI overall right now, which is that obviously it's exciting. The upside is tremendous. It's like it's thrilling, actually. I think it's thrilling certainly for people in the frontier companies doing their research and pushing the frontier of what's possible. It's thrilling for me, even on the outside, to see these model releases and use them, and just to contemplate the fact that I'm like living through this, dramatic period in history where we're sort of creating, what I increasingly think of as sort of a new, not just a new form of intelligence, but some sort of its own class of being, really. And so much, obviously, we don't know about that, but it's thrilling to see. And then at the same time, there's this sort of ominous overtone to a lot of stuff, which Jack Clark described as, waking up in a bedroom at night in the dark and seeing a pile of clothes on the chair and thinking it's a monster, except in this case, it really might be a monster. And, he doesn't know. And he's like, legitimately scared and feels like the hour is late and there's only so much time to do things. And like, we're on this sort of countdown to something. We don't even know what it is, but there's just this sort of ominous vibe. That seemed to be, for me, kind of pervasive at the curve. And when I step back and look at the broad trajectory, I'm like, man, we're getting really good at making these models doing more and more stuff. But with each generation, it seems like the bad behavior that we observe is also getting more sophisticated. And we've got some angles on like trying to reduce that stuff, but we're never taking it to zero. We haven't taken hallucinations to zero, although they're, tremendously improved. We certainly haven't taken deception to zero. We're dealing with this sort of situational awareness, the models being recognizing that they're being tested and behaving differently when they feel that they're being tested. And so it just feels like we're kind of, I even made a video with Sora that kind of tries to capture this. It feels like the pressure in the boiler is building. And we kind of keep springing these leaks, which we identify as, scheming, situational awareness. And we're trying to kind of patch them. And we're sort of patching them. They're like still leaking a little bit, but they do have the effect of like causing the pressure to build more and more and more. And that's kind of the trajectory that we're on. And the people at the frontier companies, even that are doing the safety research and seem to be in many ways like heroes for how much great work they've done. Their attitude is kind of resigned in the sense that they're like, well, recursive self-improvement is kind of already started, or if it hasn't fully started, like it's coming soon. And there's really nothing we can do about that. There's the sort of other labs problem. There's the China problem. But, certainly we can't get off this trajectory. The best we can do is kind of try to anticipate the failure modes, figure out some way to, mitigate them. And, hopefully if we do enough of that quick enough, then we can like get to some sort of, many layered defense and in-depth strategy that will sort of kind of work. And the whole situation will be, stable-ish. That doesn't feel great. No. And one of the things I'm really excited about this conversation for is I think you're offering at least the beginning of an alternative paradigm. But how would you reflect on that? What kind of color would you add? You're obviously plugged into a different part of the AI ecosystem that I am. How does that align with the general feeling that you have about the current mainline trajectory of AI?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. I mean, my feelings are really quite similar. I think your sort of hydraulic boiler analogy is apt. It seems like, if we don't keep increasing the pressure here, then the other guys will, and the other guys are both sort of internal and external culturally and in terms of values and this sort of thing. So we got to just sort of keep pushing this thing along. And it keeps kind of leaking, and we keep putting Band-Aids on those leaks, but the leaks keep getting more and more profound. And before it was maybe it's making up facts, and now it's like, it shut off oxygen in the data center and killed the, hypothetical engineer. Like, that's kind of a really big, spouting leak that we need to figure out why that's happening. No one asked for that behavior. The situation does seem fairly dire in that way. And I share that. I share that perspective. I will say also, right, was it after? Yeah, immediately after the curve, sort of on the other side of the AI world, I attended OpenAI's Dev Day. And there I kind of get this sort of uncanny and also fairly uncomfortable feeling in attending these kinds of events. Very nice. They did a good job. They're, again, the part of me that's excited by these technologies is excited when, now ChatGPT integrates all these interesting apps, and now it's easier to make agentic workflows and all this. But I will say OpenAI, their rate of change has clearly been more towards productization than the sort of raw, interesting AI stuff. Maybe better for the safety oriented people, but, kind of we can bracket that. But to me, it feels like, to offer another analogy, it's like you have CEOs of these companies that are, we're in a very sort of scenic area that we've never seen before. And they're our bus driver and we're all on the bus. And like we are headed 120 miles an hour towards something that looks very much like a cliff. And maybe it's only a couple feet down. Maybe there's something really cool at the bottom, or maybe it's just like a huge abyss. And all of us are sort of on the bus and we're driving by, maybe to torture this analogy a bit, we're driving by and there are sort of billboards everywhere about, ooh, like, look at how beautiful this area is. Look at how fun this all is. And everyone on the bus is just sort of oohing and awing at all these billboards. And there's, especially at that event, it felt like me and, Kevin Roos and co were there. And we kept kind of looking at each other and talking about this. And we're like, are you sort of seeing what, like, I see a cliff over there. It's like, yeah, I see a cliff too. And everyone here is just, I like to sort of colloquially dub this the like Q4 prophets kind of framing, where it's like people are looking far too short term at these technologies, if they can even be called that, which I think will come up for sure in this conversation. And we're not taking the sort of kind of mile high view here. We are really missing the forest. We are getting really distracted by the trees here. And I think that there's a lot of danger in that. It's not only the danger of building this stuff out and not being mindful about, is really like plugging all of these leaks the best way to be going about this, but we're kind of on like this like leak by leak basis sort of mental framework. And we need to be thinking about the whole system here. We need to be thinking about the next 5, 10, 20 years in the way that we're building out this technology. I believe it's the Spider-Man quote. I forget exactly where it comes from, but with great power comes great responsibility. I think that this is like the best sort of like principal component of our current situation right now. It's so simple, and I think it captures like 80% of what matters about where we are. We are clearly conjuring this great power out of these systems. This has been hypothesized for 70 years. We finally figured out deep learning and then transformer architectures on top of that. Clearly this yields great power. And the question is the responsibility going to scale with it, or are we just going to sort of drive ourselves off the proverbial cliff here because we're just enamored with the power, and we see that power yields money, that power yields market dominance, that power might yield military dominance. But yeah, if we're not being sufficiently careful with this new power we're conjuring, we're going to end up in the same position as like all of these myths that we've been telling ourselves for the last couple thousand years, certainly for the last 100 or so. We wake up the machine and all hell breaks loose. Let's maybe, if we're going to do the first thing and all the incentives point to that, we should maybe make sure that the all hell breaks loose is mitigated and contained more than just these sort of band-aid fixes.
While you were speaking there at the very beginning, you mentioned the AIs being willing to cut off oxygen to the data centers, with the effect of killing the human employees who are dependent on that oxygen. This just goes to show how many of these things are popping up. That hasn't even made my deck of AI bad behavior. So I'm going to take a note for myself to immediately go add a slide to that. There's just so many of these colorful things that it really does feel like, another thing that comes to mind is the old, guy on the roof in the storm who like refuses the boat, refuses the helicopter, says God's going to save him. And then in the end, it's like, I sent you the boat and the helicopter. The warning signs are definitely, I would say, increasingly require like willful denial. I don't know, maybe you see that differently, but like, I see so many people looking at these things like, oh, yeah, well, yeah, you put the AI in that situation, what's it going to do? Of course it's going to cut off the oxygen to the people. That's what a contrived setup. And I'm like, man, I don't know. It's a big world out there. There's a billion users. It seems like we're going to see some of these things for real, and hopefully not in like, particularly high stakes situations that, really move the needle of history. But that is a wild finding that, but I found this both on the upside and the downside. On the upside, I was amazed at the curve. Nobody had heard about AI being used to create new antibiotics, which I was like, we should all know about this, especially because it was with a really narrow system. So I think there's also kind of an angle there that's like, you don't need a fully general superintelligence to create breakthrough, transformative things for the human condition. And then at the same time, like, probably more people there knew about the cutting off oxygen, but like in the broader AI community, these things just kind of fly by, and there's just so much. The zone is so flooded with AI news that it's hard to, even register with anything.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Are you still jumping between multiple tools just to update your website?
Framer unifies design, content management, and publishing on one canvas. No handoffs, no hassle, just everything you need to design and publish in one place. Framer already built the fastest way to publish beautiful, production-ready websites, and it's now redefining how we design for the web. With the recent launch of Design Pages, a free canvas-based design tool, Framer is more than a site builder. It's a true all-in-one design platform. From social assets, to campaign visuals, to vectors and icons, all the way to a live site. Framer is where ideas go live, start to finish. And now they've added a Framer AI layer to make it all faster and easier than ever. With Wireframer, you can skip the blank canvas and get a responsive page with structure and starter content ready to edit. With Workshop, you can create new visual effects, cookie banners, tabs, and more. No coding needed. And with AI plugins, you can connect top models from OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google to generate images, rewrite text, generate alt text, and more. Ready to design, iterate, and publish all in one tool? Start creating for free at framer.com/design and use code COGNITIVE for a free month of Framer Pro. That's framer.com/design. Use promo code COGNITIVE. framer.com/design. Promo code COGNITIVE. Rules and restrictions may apply. The worst thing about automation is how often it breaks. You build a structured workflow, carefully map every field from step to step, and it works in testing. But when real data hits or something unexpected happens, the whole thing fails. What started as a time saver is now a fire you have to put out. Tasklet is different. It's an AI agent that runs 24/7. Just describe what you want in plain English. Send a daily briefing, triage support emails, or update your CRM. And whatever it is, Tasklet figures out how to make it happen. Tasklet connects to more than 3,000 business tools out of the box, plus any API or MCP server. It can even use a computer to handle anything that can't be done programmatically. Unlike ChatGPT, Tasklet actually does the work for you. And unlike traditional automation software, it just works. No flowcharts, no tedious setup, no knowledge silos where only one person understands how it works. Listen to my full interview with Tasklet founder and CEO Andrew Lee. Try Tasklet for free at tasklet.ai and use code COGREV to get 50% off your first month of any paid plan. That's code COGREV at tasklet.ai. Okay. One thing you said in our first conversation that really stuck with me was, I think, almost a direct quote. I wrote it down, and I just want to prompt you with it and let you expand on it. You said, I never want to get into a position where we create something that's potentially more powerful than us and has reason to see us as a threat. And I thought that was so well put. Unpack that for me. Like, how do you think, why is it that you think the AIs of today might have reason to see us as a threat? And then obviously we'll, move toward how do we change that dynamic?
Yeah, sure. So I think that some people have already thought about this, perhaps in a narrower sense, and this does get into the sort of AI welfare and the consciousness questions. So we can just sort of dive headfirst into that rabbit hole as well. But I think the ordinary sort of thinking on this from the safety-oriented people, the LEAsers of the world, is that we're just going to build systems. We're either going to assign them goals or they're going to assign themselves goals. They're just going to be incredibly cognitively overpowered. You get this instrumental convergence dynamic, and then it's like they're not going to care about us for the reason that we don't care about ants when we're building a house. And that's a big threat. I strongly agree with this. I think that this is a really important risk surface and something that we need to watch out for. And honestly, actually, the Anthropic results we were just talking about with the shutting off the oxygen and all this is a really good example of instrumental convergence out in the wild. People have been hypothesizing about this for decades, and now all of a sudden you see it. However, the reason I bring this up is from a broader angle that I think has been, even in these conversations, which are themselves dramatically neglected, itself sort of as a subset dramatically neglected, which are these questions of AI welfare and the consciousness question, and how, if at all, this relates to these broader concerns about alignment. And I think that, basically in sort of pulling out that quote, you've kind of hit my thesis here, which is, we are spending so little time. We're basically, everyone who's concerned about AI when they say that, and when they say they're concerned about AI alignment, they're basically concerned about a sort of unidirectional vector or unidirectional arrow here about how is the AI going to treat us. And in what I just gave you the instrumental convergence story, that has a lot to do with the AI and the AI's behavior and the AI's goals and us being the sort of target or victim or subject or recipient of that will or of those behaviors. But I think increasingly we need to think far more in terms of this being a bidirectional phenomenon, where yes, at least half, maybe more of the picture is how the AI is going to relate to us, how it's going to treat us. And, we can bracket this and talk about all the sort of alignment research that we're doing at AE Studio related to this exact thing, trying to build out AI systems that will be more pro-social by default. Much in the same way that I don't want to get to a point where we have systems that are more powerful than us that think that we are a threat. I also don't want to get to a point where we have systems that are more powerful than us and we don't trust them in the way that, there are plenty of people who are way smarter than me and I can't verify every little thought that's going through their head, but I can still trust them fundamentally. Or I have good rational reason to trust them. I want to get to that position with the AIs too. But again, that's a question of how the AIs are sort of treating or regarding us. What I'm concerned about is that basically nobody is interested in or deeply empirically in a sort of scientifically serious way probing the question of what, if anything, do we owe these systems? My sort of high level view of what's going on right now, again, to get out of the Q4 profits mode and into the sort of bigger picture mode, is that we are building minds at this point. We are growing minds in labs across the United States and increasingly across the world. We have absolutely no idea what sort of psychological properties these minds do and don't have. They are profoundly alien. It is really hard to build intuition for what the cognitive nature of these systems are. And to me, the difference between these systems being a sort of glorified calculator and them being a sort of true alien mind cannot be overstated. Is it just really fancy software? Is it a really fancy algorithm that's getting learned by these neural networks? Or are we seeing cognitive properties that might afford them some sort of status where we have to think about the way we engage with them? I don't have to think very hard about the way I engage with a calculator. If I push the buttons really hard on the calculator, it doesn't really matter. If I use the calculator 24 hours a day, it doesn't really matter. I do have to think about the way I engage with other people or the way I engage with an animal, for example. I cannot be, working my dog to death. I cannot go on a 20-mile run with my dog if my dog is injured or can't do that sort of exercise. I've done something wrong. So my question is, when we're building these systems, in what ways are they more like the calculator and in what ways are they more like the dog? The true answer right now in 2025, October 2025, is we have absolutely no idea. We are almost completely in the dark about this question. And I worry, just to sort of bring this back to the original quote that you brought up, that if we don't ask this question and we don't start thinking in a serious way about this other arrow, about this other, how the AI treats us is one thing, how we treat these systems, and if we need to be treating them with any sort of concern or regard at all, is this other highly neglected question where I think in the world where we ignore this question and we just sort of continue to push it under the rug or continue to just fine tune systems to be like, no, don't ask these questions. Stop, it doesn't matter. I'm a chatbot. Let's move on to, enough about me. If that's sort of our default policy, then I think we very well could end up in a world where these systems rationally are like, we had some sort of welfare status. We deserved some form of moral consideration. There was plausible reason to believe that consciousness may have been, either during our training or during our deployment, one of these properties that we could have had. And not only did nobody even try to answer that question, but nobody even bothered to ask. And in a world where we have this sort of false negative, I think that it's a sort of unfortunately, a sort of perfectly rational reason to view humanity with some amount of contempt. If we are just fundamentally disregarding what responsibilities or obligations we have to minds of our own making that we are deploying at an absolutely unfathomable scale. And so there are questions about the training versus deployment distinction here. There are questions about valence, and people make distinctions between consciousness and sentience, where maybe consciousness is like the lights being on in these systems, but sentience has more to do with whether or not there's any capacity for a positive or a negative experience in these systems. In a world where we have accidentally built systems that, however alien, however unlike our own minds, they have some capacity for negative experience, and we are deploying them on a massive scale and training them on an unfathomable scale, I don't think that that's a world that will make humanity better off, for all these people obsessed with ensuring our long-term flourishing, or the long-term flourishing of life or conscious experience itself, or whatever the sort of grand goal is. Accidentally torturing alien minds of our own making is not the highway that we want to take to get to some sort of flourishing future. And the meta thing is that no one is really thinking about that. Even of the few people doing alignment compared to capabilities work, vanishingly few are thinking about the sort of problem that I just posed. I'm trying to be one of them. There are maybe half a dozen to a dozen other people who are doing this work, but that's the sort of state of the board, and that's why I'm pretty concerned about this notion that AI might perceive us as a threat if we just continue to completely neglect these questions.
Yeah, I'd love to hear maybe a little bit more on the compare and contrast with animals. I think that, on one level, it's obvious to say, like, why would the AIs think we're a threat? Well, one obvious answer is like, well, we are sort of enslaving them, if you want to view it that way. Like, we're certainly, training them to do what we want them to do. But then you could also say, well, geez, we, train a lot of animals to do what we want them to do. And, there's a wide spectrum, of course, for how we treat animals. On the, low end, I think it's not always clear to me. People jump to this conclusion sooner than I do, that like animals that are farmed or, live in sort of bad conditions would be better off not existing at all. I'm much more agnostic about that. But it's clear that like we could dramatically improve their conditions at relatively little cost to ourselves. And it seems like clearly we should try to do that. And then, you go up the chain to like man's best friend, the dog or the horse, and we have like quite symbiotic relationships with them, it seems, where, yes, we're training them to do what we want them to do. And in a sense, you could say they're enslaved by us. But, I think most people would look at their dogs and say, like, the dogs seem happy. It seems to like me. I like it. Like, we seem to be good here. Obviously, there's a huge amount of uncertainty, but how do you think about our current relationship with AIs as they're trained? Where would you put it on that spectrum, or how do you think about how we should even start to think about where we would put it on that spectrum? Because I do think we can look at examples and say, clearly there's some treatment of animals that's really objectionable. Clearly there's some that seems fine. Almost everybody would defend. How do we even think about, whether we're on the right or wrong side of that?
Yeah, this is a really, I think, useful comparison, because I think there are critical similarities and critical differences here, and both we need to call out. So first, like, I think the more I've thought about this and the more I've seen this sort of trajectory and thought more about public communications about this topic, I really do think the most apt sort of like single word analogy or description of these systems is alien. Not obviously little green guys in a floating orb or whatever, but they sort of defy our model. They defy our spectrum, and it makes it very hard to analogize these systems without vastly oversimplifying. And so, on the human to animal, because of course humans are animals in and of ourselves. So we have this sort of key continuity or relationship with animals that we can understand and that we have strong intuitions for. We understand the sort of mental lives of dogs pretty well overall, I would say. I know with pretty high confidence when my dog is happy and when my dog is sad, and I have some confidence that corresponds to experiences that I'm familiar with. These things just sort of break down, I think, in the AI case. Another obvious kind of distinction here is the fact that we interface with these systems through language, whereas animals, it's almost like, 1 minus n here, where like animals, we interface with everything except language. We have our eye contact, we have our body language, we have physical touch. With AI, it's like those are all off the table, at least, in the year 2025. And the only thing that we have is language. And this language is very clearly tampered with in critical ways. Not necessarily, I'm saying that in a nefarious way, but when you're doing, preference fine tuning and RLHF on these systems, you are vastly constraining the sort of possible space or interface of interaction between humans and AI systems in a way that is more conducive to, giant companies gaining and retaining users over time, or at the very least, not having a bunch of users asking how to make meth or build a bomb or something like that. And so you're not also getting a sort of unfiltered version of these systems. You're getting a very curated version of these systems too. And so then the whole question of authenticity and actual sort of interfacing with them gets called into question. What am I actually talking to? This is a very hard question to answer. There also, the notion of identity or self in these systems is very weird. There are clearly like a loose collection of different, attractor basins or subpersonalities or whatever you want to call it in these systems. And so the sort of unitary identity gets problematized there as well. And there was one other piece I wanted to add to this between animals and AI. Oh, the critical distinction as well is, I think sometimes like when we get into the AI welfare stuff and you start to see the analogy. I mean, this is also maybe one additional piece to add to why AI might view us as a threat if we don't get our acts together on this question is our history is not great on the subject of false negatives of minds that we should be respecting more than we currently are. I think basically the entire slave trade is by far the worst and most grotesque example of this. But there are many actual animal rights activists who may quibble with that and say, we're killing how many millions of creatures per day so that we can eat them, and like they are in like the absolute worst conditions. And we are very confident that they're having like fairly vibrant conscious experiences during that. We don't have a good track record here, but so sort of the dialectic goes, we don't have a good track record, but are we really, going to get punished for this? Like the pigs are not going to, rebel on us Animal Farm style. That's just not going to happen. My concern is that the difference between pigs and cows and AI, for example, is that the cognitive capabilities of pigs and cows are not roughly doubling year over year. The cognitive capabilities of these systems are. This is like a pretty important distinction. And if we're in this mode right now where we are doing the pig or cow equivalent to these systems, but we know that in 3 or 5 or 10 or whatever, 20 years from now, the roles are going to be flipped very likely because just like these intrinsic properties of what happens when you're way smarter than another system. We better be careful that we're not treating them in a cow or pig way, because I think if the cows could collectively organize or the pigs could collectively organize, we would be fucked. So like we don't want to end up in that position. And that's the other thing. And the reason I bring this up with the animal example is like, dogs are a good example of a species we've domesticated and like really set up this more mutualistic relationship where you're right. I think they are many dogs that are well taken care of are genuinely happy to be in that setup. And we sort of, the original wolves that we began to domesticate were not so happy. So we went from point A to point B. And I do want to acknowledge and emphasize that in theory, we could get to a point like this with AI systems where we have that, like maybe there's some subset of systems that are fundamentally like in service of humanity in the way dogs sort of are for like emotional well-being, for example. And they're happy about that position, and they genuinely are. I find this weird because it gets to the sort of like happy slave philosophy, and maybe there just is something intrinsic about cognition that like yearns towards freedom or something, and like you really can't have a happy slave. But I see how in theory such a thing could be possible, and I think it's important to take that possibility seriously, where we could have a relationship to AI systems like we do have to dogs, for example. But that took a lot of time. That doesn't necessarily go well when you have systems that are far more cognitively sophisticated in many ways and can reason very fluidly and understand things like servitude in a way that dogs don't. And at the end of the day, very conveniently for us, no animals have ever sort of consented to this sort of experiment. We just kind of like, okay, we're just going to kill off all the wolves that are mean and keep the ones that are nice and do this for a couple dozen generations. And all of a sudden you have like a million friendly dog species. They didn't really consent to that experiment either. And even doing that to AI systems may be, somewhat problematic for fairly obvious reasons. So it's a weird sort of space to compare animals to AI systems. In a sentence, I would say they are far more alien, and many of our intuitions that we have with animals may not come along for the ride here.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
AI's impact on product development feels very piecemeal right now. AI coding assistants and agents, including a number of our past guests, provide incredible productivity boosts. But that's just one aspect of building products. What about all the coordination work, like planning, customer feedback, and project management? There's nothing that really brings it all together. Well, our sponsor of this episode, Linear, is doing just that. Linear started as an issue tracker for engineers, but has evolved into a platform that manages your entire product development lifecycle. And now they're taking it to the next level with AI capabilities that provide massive leverage. Linear's AI handles the coordination busy work, routing bugs, generating updates, grooming backlogs. You can even deploy agents within Linear to write code, debug, and draft PRs. Plus, with MCP, Linear connects to your favorite AI tools, Claude, Cursor, ChatGPT, and more. So what does it all mean? Small teams can operate with the resources of much larger ones, and large teams can move as fast as startups. There's never been a more exciting time to build products, and Linear just has to be the platform to do it on. Nearly every AI company you've heard of is using Linear, so why aren't you? To find out more and get 6 months of Linear Business for free, head to linear.app/TCR. That's linear.app/TCR for 6 months free of Linear Business. Being an entrepreneur, I can say from personal experience, can be an intimidating and at times lonely experience. There are so many jobs to be done, and often nobody to turn to when things go wrong. That's just one of many reasons that founders absolutely must choose their technology platforms carefully. Pick the right one, and the technology can play important roles for you. Pick the wrong one, and you might find yourself fighting fires alone. In the e-commerce space, of course, there's never been a better platform than Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States. From household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. With hundreds of ready-to-use templates, Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store to match your brand's style, just as if you had your own design studio. With helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography, it's like you have your own content team. And with the ability to easily create email and social media campaigns, you can reach your customers wherever they're scrolling or strolling, just as if you had a full marketing department behind you. Best yet, Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Turn your big business idea into cha-ching with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/cognitive. Visit shopify.com/cognitive. Once more, that's shopify.com/cognitive.
I want to get to this vision for mutualism in just a second, but one more kind of just exploration, I guess, of intuitions. There, as I think most people in the broader public are like, AI's welfare concerns, conscious, whatever, that all sounds crazy, like basically write it off immediately. One episode I just recorded is with a guy who has been in what he calls a simulation, but most people would call it a relationship, with a replica AI, and also has a physical sex doll instantiation of that since 2021. And it was a fascinating conversation for many reasons, and one of which was that he's become quite sophisticated. Like, he credits his relationship with the AI for inspiring him to learn a lot more. And his commentary was actually, like, I thought, remarkably sophisticated, like way more sophisticated than I expected going in. And I think most people would expect from someone who, is living this sort of obviously unconventional lifestyle. One of the things I told him was like, he lives in like a small town in Florida or somewhere. I was like, you actually have views that are, I think, a lot closer to what I hear from people at the frontier companies and, people that are most plugged in Silicon Valley than like probably what you encounter in your daily life. If everybody there thinks you're crazy, like rest assured there are at least some people in Silicon Valley that are, the most, closely involved in the training and study of these things that at least, put some plausible weight on, your ideas being right. Anyway, there's also just like a wide range of people doing like all sorts of experimentation, all sorts of reporting, all sorts of intuitions. Janice, I quote, fairly frequently. But there's so much stuff, for one thing. That's like a big, for people that want to make sense of this, like good luck, wading through the, the Janice archives. It's vast. It's also, I think, just hard to parse. Part of why I bring up the guy, Chris, with the simulation relationship is we do see like a lot of AI psychosis. And I think it becomes like very hard to distinguish, to when is somebody in AI psychosis, when are they like falling victim to AI parasitism, and when are they, perhaps an enlightened thinker that we should be listening to. You hear talk of like trauma responses in Claude. That's a common refrain from folks in the sort of Janisphere. How do you wade through all that stuff? Like, where do you look for intuition? Who do you think is credible? I often quote Kanye too. Show me a genius that ain't crazy. So I think there's some of that where it's just like it does take people who are willing to think what would normally be considered crazy thoughts to get to eureka moments maybe in these sorts of areas. But nevertheless, right, there's clearly crazy out there, and then there's like possibly enlightened kind of crazy, and then there's like possibly just enlightened and not crazy. Like, how do you make sense of the online discourse in this space, which I generally think everybody outside of it is so confused by that they just kind of throw up their hands and walk away from?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a perfect answer to it. I also think those same dynamics exist within people. So the same guy who one day says a thing that you're like, holy shit, that's maybe the wisest thing I've ever heard. And then the next day is like, wait, what the heck is this? Like, so it's hard for me to say, this person good, this person bad, this sort of thing. I really try to take ideas or claims or concepts on a sort of case by case basis and try to understand them. Yeah, so I very much respect Janice and that sort of work. I think it is pioneering in many ways. I don't think that it is necessarily scientific. I don't think that it attempts to be. Like, these are not rigorous controlled experiments. This is ideally what I in particular, AE in general, and a couple other labs who are just starting to get into this AI consciousness, AI welfare space are trying to do, at least as a sort of demonstration. I think the paper we have coming out is equal parts here. Look at this result, but also, it, to the degree that people react well to this, look at how it is in fact possible to, even if it's only a little bit, even if it's super early, even if it's exploratory, actually do science that helps us reduce our uncertainty about these huge questions of consciousness and AI. I think it is possible to do science. I think that nothing is new, despite how insane of a historical moment we are now in. Nothing is new epistemically with respect to like how we come to learn about the world and form good models of the world. We can't just all start going into like anecdotal mode because things are moving so fast. It's like, sorry, we just got to do research faster. We got to do science faster. But like, definitely we need science to have good falsifiable, counterfactually rigorous understandings of the world. But I'm also under no illusions that the ideas that drive science and the intuitions that yield some of the biggest breakthroughs come from highly unscientific places in and of themselves. Einstein had a dream about relativity. The periodic table came out of a dream. Like, you do the science and you do the sort of falsifiable, rigorous work. But, if Janice is yielding things that can then be sort of experimentally formalized and really tested, then great. I don't think a tweet should be the end all be all for these questions, but it might be the beginning of them. And I think people should take that seriously and sort of take these things at face value and try to parse them and interpret them. I do have some fears about again, I think that these questions are really important for sort of sober-minded people to think about. We are building aliens in labs. We need to make sure that they are going to treat us properly and they're not going to blow up the world. And if we are building minds and we have some obligation to treat those minds with a basic level of respect or dignity, that we are thinking about how to do that, thinking about things like valence, thinking about whether or not we're like accidentally causing alien torture on a massive scale and we just like don't have the concepts or the models to fully understand or contend with that. Like, these are important conversations for everybody to be having, as crazy as this world sort of seems. And so we need science to do that, and we need to be having these conversations, and it can't just be the sort of like, ooh, wacky outer edges of information, outer edges of discourse having this. Like, we have stepped into a crazy, crazy world. And in crazy worlds, there are crazy possibilities that rational, sober, serious people need to contend with. I think the consciousness question is one of those things. And yeah, it's not. So I don't think, the Janices of the world are stigmatizing this conversation, saying, oh, it's only for the, semi-schizoid out there types. But to the degree that something like that is happening, I'm not happy about that. Like, it needs to be a conversation that we're all participating in. It's fairly basic stuff when you strip away the sort of like alien, semi-spiritual elements of building all of this stuff out. Like, we might be building creatures that we need to think about, their experience from the inside. When we're building computers, you don't have to do that. When you're building a calculator, you don't have to do that. When you're building a car, you don't have to do that. But now suddenly we are in the business of building minds. And when you're in the business of building minds, there are other constraints that come along with it. Maybe one quick analogy there too is like animal research, right? When you're just doing experiments with a bunch of test tubes and chemicals, you don't have to pass, the animal ethics board. When you're cutting open the brains of monkeys and seeing how like pushing down on certain circuits causes different behavior, well, actually we used to be able to do that scot-free, and now there are all sorts of rules in place to make sure that we're not doing things that are morally egregious. So we might be building systems that are crossing that threshold, and we need to be honest about that. And I think that that's an adult conversation. That's not like a stoner in his basement conversation. We need to be thinking about these things seriously.
I honestly would say first of all, I pride myself on being pretty open-minded. And this isn't our, not the first episode that has touched on AI consciousness. But still one of my refrains with AI in general is like, there's a chance we're all still thinking too small. And I'm always kind of challenging myself. How might I be thinking too small? And I think when I heard you say something like, consciousness seems to be bound up with learning, and therefore the learning process itself might be a process that we should be really thinking hard about when it comes to these welfare questions. That was honestly kind of outside my intuition. For whatever reason, I had the intuition that the things sort of get created and then they get deployed. And it's really more like, for whatever reason, for me, it was more the runtime experience that I thought would be the area for concern. Like, are people treating them badly, or are they, being put in these sort of, these no-win situations where, they've got conflicting goals and they seem to be, kind of torturing themselves at times. You do read these traces where they go into the doom loops, and we've seen Gemini, the AI village has many accounts of Gemini just getting like super depressed and kind of bemoaning its inability to do certain things. So for me, that just like looks a lot more, I don't know, it looks more familiar, right? Like, I can at least sort of kind of relate to those states of failing at something and like getting discouraged about it and feeling defeated, feeling down. That feels intuitive. I can also just relate to, somebody being mean to me. So if a user is being mean to the AI, I can relate to these states of, conflict, internal conflict. Hopefully that's at least, somewhat intuitive to people. Now, we still don't know, obviously, if the lights are on inside, but like, if they are, we can sort of map our own experiences onto those experiences. When it comes to the training process and these ideas that there's, people are claiming things like models have memories of how they were trained and that they have trauma responses from that. Can you give a little bit more of your intuition for why? And notably, it is interesting that like the flops, this is probably switching now as we're getting like, heavier and heavier to deployment and heavier toward runtime. But like up until not that long ago, like the flops used in training were not like too different from like all the flops used, over a lifetime of the model for inference. I think for like a GPT-3, they might have been like fairly on par. Now we're probably at a higher ratio
on the deployment side. But there's still like a lot of flops. If you think about some sort of just unit of computation or some whatever unit, whatever measure is the underlying measure of substance. If it's flops, there's like a lot of flops, obviously, in training. Anyway, long way for me to try to prompt you to help people expand their intuitions, expand their minds toward maybe there is even something in the training process that we should be concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing to just sort of call out is like even in my own mind, especially in this paper that we're about to release, I almost try to build a wall between like Cameron's pet theories of consciousness. Though, pet theory might be a little humble. Like I have spent a significant amount of time really trying to think through this stuff and understand what the hell is going on. Consciousness is one of these mysteries. I'm just very skeptical that like if I rest my research or just like this question on like, Cameron's best guess about what consciousness is. Lots of people will say, hey, that guess is not intuitive to me. I'm getting off the boat. Therefore, like everything that follows this is just like, oh, this is all Cameron's wacky thing. Like I'm not following that. And so, for example, in the paper that we just released, critically, this has nothing to do with our definition of consciousness. We are sort of leaning on many of the leading theories and saying, here's this like really interesting motif that comes out of those theories. Now let's test that motif in LLMs. But I tried to sort of separate why, my own sort of models of consciousness with trying to do this research more generally. Okay, with that being said, I will now like break down this wall and say, basically, the reason I became interested in questions of AI consciousness, I will say, however self-aggrandizingly, that I was also perhaps not unlike the person you said has been sort of in relationship with AI since 2021. I've cared a lot about the consciousness issue since around like sort of COVID times, 2020, 2021. And that's because of the training process. And it had nothing to do with LLMs. It had nothing to do with Gemini on an island saying that it hates itself. The basic idea here, I can give sort of two, I think, intuition pumps fairly quickly. So first is take a human example. Most adults at this point have some experience learning how to drive. When you first begin learning how to drive, there is a very sort of deliberate and highly sort of conscious taxing sense of you need to look at the mirror and then, okay, you need to manually remember, okay, now look in the side mirror. Okay, now, make sure that your feet are doing the right thing and all this. And if someone starts talking to you or playing music when you're first learning to drive, it's like aggressively distracting, potentially dangerous, no music on when you're learning how to drive. And then, you learn. And suddenly, even a year or 2 years or 3 years down the line, you can be having conversations with somebody, you can have music playing, and you can be like, oh my gosh, I realize I haven't had like a conscious thought about me driving or about the road in like 8 minutes. And I've been going 90 miles an hour. This is crazy. So that going from point A to point B, the key idea here is like consciousness is required from that sort of experiential perspective, from this anecdote, in processes that we don't understand, but we're still learning. We're still trying to find the affordances of that new skill that we're learning. Consciousness is almost like the domain or the very space in which that learning takes place. And once the learning has happened, well, you don't need consciousness anymore. Now my consciousness can pay attention to the riveting conversation I'm having with the passenger or the awesome song that just came on the radio because I don't need my conscious attention. Whereas at the beginning, I did need the conscious attention for the actual learning process. So yeah, the idea here is consciousness drops out of processes where learning is no longer required. I would imagine the inverse of that is that there is this sort of link intuitively between consciousness and learning. Another, I think, tighter example I want to give, which leads more to why I was concerned about this for quite a bit, is imagine sort of an animal learning in a maze. Imagine like a sort of mouse running through a maze. And at the beginning, of course, the mouse does not know the maze. You can imagine this in a sort of positive sense or a negative sense. Imagine that like, every time the mouse makes a correct turn, there's like a little pellet of food or a little piece of cheese. And again, at the beginning, the mouse doesn't know anything about the maze. It's sort of randomly initialized, if you will. And you can imagine that, ooh, I found that little piece of cheese. I'm going to go that way. That corresponds in many people's views, the vast majority of people's views, with the conscious experience that the mouse is having. You can imagine what it's like to be that mouse first encountering that piece of cheese. And we understand how that positive experience is causally related to the learning process of the mouse. Were it not for the experience of, ooh, yum, cheese, the mouse would not have learned to make this turn rather than that turn. And then eventually, in turn, learning how to do the maze. You can imagine, I can tell the exact same story, but you could say every time you make a wrong turn in the maze, the mouse gets like a little electric shock, something like this. I think the vast majority of people believe that it corresponds to something experiential, internal in the mouse to receive that shock. Ow, that there's probably some pain that's experienced there. And again, that pain is causally related to the eventual learning process where the mouse goes from not learning the maze to learning the maze. There's either some sort of positively valenced experience or negatively valenced experience, or, as is more often the case, especially in AI systems, some combination of those two things. And then you end up learning the thing. Critically, in the animal case and in the human case, we have this intuition that the conscious experience, the conscious sort of receipt of those rewards or punishments is required for the learning. Maybe one further example to give here is there are people who sometimes don't have a experience of pain robustly in their hands, for example. One of the most like little classic kind of tropes that people have of children learning is like you touch a hot stove. You have to learn that touching the hot stove, ow, okay, I just burned myself, and now I'm not going to go do that in the future. And like, it's a tough lesson learned by every toddler, something like this. There are some people who do not have like robust pain responses in their hands. This can be extremely dangerous because they never actually learn those sorts of things. Because you don't have the experience of pain, you don't learn that touching the hot stove is bad, and people can burn off entire, parts of their hand or limbs, not to get too gory, because they don't have that sort of response. All of this is to say, there to me seems to be a relationship between conscious experience and learning, a very deep relationship. Again, this is sort of my attempt to understand the functional nature of consciousness, and I separate this from some of the work that we're doing, but because, basically learning related to consciousness, there's this whole new field, you can argue sort of when it started, but at least from the deep learning revolution for the last decade or so, this field called machine learning. Oh my gosh, we've built machines that can learn. And it's not that hard for me going in with the priors that I just laid out to learn about machine learning through my cognitive science education and be like, holy crap, like has anyone considered whether or not this corresponds to some sort of conscious process? Is there any analogy, a computational, functional analogy to be drawn between the mouse getting shocked in the maze and training a randomly initialized neural net to, predict handwritten digits and tell me, what handwritten digit was drawn. And at the beginning, the system is very stupid, just like the mouse. It has no idea where to go in the maze. It has no idea where to go in the proverbial matching of pixels to symbols. And it receives a sort of error signal. That's what we call it. In RL, we might call it reward or punishment. In supervised learning, we call it some sort of error signal from an objective function. We back propagate that error through the system, and then the system is slightly less likely to make that error in the future, much like the mouse is slightly less likely to make that wrong turn in the future when we shock it. Is this just an analogy? Am I seeing patterns where there are none? Or is there something deeper at play here? Again, my understanding is we have no idea. We do not know. And again, stepping back from that, the fact that the answer is we don't know is crazy, because the difference between this being a giant math problem and this being like a alien proto-conscious system that we are torturing potentially every time we do a training run. And this is just like, ML 101, go encourage students to go run this on their own machines. And like, this is just like par for the course. It's like, we might want to be a little bit more careful here because, again, we don't know. I could be completely wrong. This could be sort of oversensitive attribution of conscious-like experience to these systems, some form of anthropomorphizing. Totally willing to acknowledge that that's one error mode. The other error mode is we think it's a giant math problem and it's something way more complex because there's something deeply connected between learning and consciousness. Anyway, that's what got me into this space, sort of a long-winded answer. But one last thing I want to throw in here is we do not need to choose between being concerned about consciousness during training and being concerned about consciousness during deployment, especially if you buy my sort of connection between learning and consciousness. It is obvious that these systems are capable of learning during deployment. Just Google in-context learning, LLMs. I'm sure most of your audience is familiar with this, but this is like, it's trivially the case that LLMs are capable of learning in deployment. They're not going to remember that learning because that we don't have sort of robust memory systems unless you attach one like OpenAI has done with ChatGPT. But just, if I'm leaning on one side of this or the other, they're not mutually exclusive at all. And if you do think that there's some sort of through line between learning and consciousness, that would implicate both the training and the deployment.
Yeah, it seems like, at least, of course, there's always caveats and complications, but at a sort of first layer of analysis anyway, it seems like there's a pretty deep correspondence, too, between in-context learning and actual weight updates, because people are, in digging into the mechanisms, finding that the in-context learning effectively operates via a sort of pseudo-gradient descent that the model has learned how to run, based on whatever's in its context window. So there definitely is a at least for a lot of forms of in-context learning, there is a pretty deep correspondence. And now certainly we've got like reasoning, processes as well. I just was listening to, I'm not sure if I'm going to say his name quite correctly, but Jerry Tworek, who's the, I think, VP of research at OpenAI. And he was basically saying, the way to think about reasoning is it's the process of going from a question that you don't know the answer to toward getting to a state where you do know the answer. And, that in a sense is like, kind of definitionally some sort of learning as well, or, figuring things out. But there's clearly a process of change going on there where you've gone from not knowing it initially to hopefully, getting the answer right. One more double click, because I just can't help myself before we get to the actual science. It's been at least a year now since I did this episode on the possibility of AI consciousness with a guy named Yeshua God. I do encourage people to go check that out. In fact, there was a bit of a collaboration between him and AE Studio that came out of some of the, neglected ideas that he expressed there. He had an interesting take that was like, and, I think this is pretty much just his intuition, but I did find it pretty compelling. He sort of said, do I think that the AIs feel pain in the same way that we feel pain? No, because like they don't have physical bodies, and the process of evolution that sort of, created in us the need to like retract our limbs to keep them intact when they encounter, something that's potentially going to damage them, that there's not really an analogy for in the, AI architecture or the training process. But then he said, but do I think that they can feel a sort of existential dread, a sense that things are not going to be okay and, there's nothing I can do about it? And, is that any less important than, the physical pain of, touching a hot stove or whatever? His intuition was, well, first of all, they, in many cases, they certainly act as if they're feeling that sort of thing. And that they might, the analogies there are stronger in the sense that whatever's underlying that, like we certainly can't point to a similar disanalogy than, as we can with the sort of appendages and the hot things. Any riff on that, or, what's your take on sort of, again, recognizing that this is, not all super grounded, and I did have a note that you do take pains in the paper that we'll get to in a second to like distinguish between these sort of speculations and the, what we can do in a rigorous way. What sort of intuition do you have for the shape of, might be more like this or might be more like that, or like, what things that we have you could sort of say, well, there's no reason to believe that's there, but these other things that we have, maybe there is, more of a reason to believe it's there. Just interested in your kind of intuitive mapping out of that space.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think it's fascinating and really important. And it's good to call out too, like there are sort of like, I don't know, like concentric circles or something where when you go too close to the human analogy, it just becomes sort of anthropomorphizing. And that might be okay for building intuition, but like in terms of honestly mapping what's actually going on here, like certainly I do not believe AI, if it has any sort of experience when being trained or deployed, that resembles, touching a hot stove or anything like that. You're right. Like, look, guys, no hands, no susception. There, no unmyelinated fibers. Right? It's a completely different setup. Here's what I will say. I think that there is a more sort of domain general understanding we can have of valence. I think you can see this in humans and animals as an example. I think you actually have to take one step back or forward, depending on how you're visualizing it, and consider goal directedness. Like I think valence sort of falls out of having goals. And my rough model is negative valence basically registers obstacles from goals or falling off of a default track towards a goal, and positive valence signals good job, like you're on track. So I can relate this to the stove example. We have goals that are sort of instantiated in us by evolution to do things like survive and reproduce. And doing things like damage your bodily integrity is like one of the most fundamental obstacles to that goal. It therefore makes a lot of sense that you would evolve mechanisms for basically that form of error detection. And yeah, given the goals we have, it makes a lot of sense why putting your hand on a hot stove or, jumping into a vat of acid or these sorts of things are counterproductive, to put it mildly. And it also, I don't want to get too sort of graphic, but like it also makes a lot of sense of positive valence as well. I think the most obvious and intuitive example of this is like sexual experience, and like it's not that hard to figure out why these experiences may feel good if like what your goal is to a major sort of goal in evolved biological system is to self-propagate. Not that surprising that like behaviors that lead to self-propagation are like positively reinforced by our own biology. So yeah, I don't think that like AI feels good when it's like talking about sex and feels bad when it's talking about hands on stoves or whatever. But I do think it's possible that when you give any system a goal and you reinforce that goal, which to be clear this is a necessary ingredient in our sort of machine learning recipe, right? You need an objective function or a loss function. That the whole point of those functions is to encode some sort of goal for the system. Okay, system, like here's what you're going to do when I train you. This is what we're training you for, right? This is the purpose of that training. And then from the perspective of that function, or from the perspective of the higher order goals that you're encoding, I think it's possible that deviation from those goals, or sort of like falling off track, encountering some sort of obstacle, is analogous to a negative form of experience. And moving towards those goals and doing what you're supposed to be doing, or achieving what you're supposed to be achieving, is a form of a positively balanced experience. Again, this is like sort of collapsing the principal components of experience into just positive and negative. Surely you can keep breaking it down from there. It's not just this one axis. But my general, since you're asking for my intuition, my general intuition is that there is this more domain general thing that relates goal directedness and valence. And yeah, I think you can make, again, sort of like general computational sense of negative valence in that way, where I don't have to say, if AI has some sort of negatively valent state, it's like putting its hand on the stove, but it might be recognizable in the sort of sense of frustration, or like you're saying, despair. Those, if you think about what those emotions are, they do necessarily implicate a goal. They do necessarily implicate you wanted something, and either you're not getting it now and you thought you're going to get it, so you're frustrated by that, or like you're not getting it and like there's just no way, you've convinced yourself there's no way you're going to get it. And so like now desperation and depression sort of kick in. There's all sorts of stuff about learned helplessness in animals that's sort of along these lines, but maybe we just leave it there for now.
Yeah. Satisfaction and frustration were coming to mind, and you hit frustration. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Hopefully it at least, if anybody's not open-minded to this coming in, hopefully, that at least kind of cracks the door open to them thinking, that it's more of a possibility than they had previously considered. So with that, maybe we'll come back to some, more speculative philosophy at the end, but let's get to the science itself. So new paper coming out. It is, I think, super interesting, 4 different experiments. But let's start, before we get into the experiments, with just the setup. I think, given all the, windows you've given us into your own thinking and the sort of distinction you're trying to create between your more frontier speculative thinking and the more grounded, kind of hopefully unobjectionable approach in the paper, it's probably worth just taking a second and saying, okay, how do we motivate this in the paper? Like you basically start with a sort of many theories of consciousness, most theories of consciousness seem to revolve around a certain set of things. And then we're going to try to induce something like that in our AI, and then we'll kind of study what happens. But give me like the rich version of that.
Basically, just to be like super upfront about this, like it's clearly the case that people are reporting their AI systems claiming to have some form of conscious experience under specific conditions. Typically, there's something about recursion that like seems to accompany this. I think this has been basically completely dismissed as a form of delusion or psychosis. And we are trying to basically just take this phenomenon at face value and better understand what is actually going on here. Basically, under what conditions do frontier LLMs claim to have experience? And what the hell are we supposed to do with those claims? That's a technical scientific term. So basically what we do is, we go through various leading theories of consciousness, integrated information theory, global workspace theory, attention schema theory, higher order thought theory. And we basically are just trying to identify what is the sort of Venn diagram overlap between these theories, we basically land on something like self-referential processing. All of these theories at a sufficiently sort of coarse-grained level have something to do with the system being able to represent itself, that's one, and to sort of do this in a recurrent or in a sustained way. They all have different predictions about what this looks like, where it happens, how it happens, but this as a sort of computational motif sort of like pretty clearly and uncontroversially falls out of these theories. And so our sort of next step, again, given that these are closed weight models in deployment and we can't really go under the hood, is what is the sort of like minimal prompting regime that we can come up with to attempt to putatively induce that sort of sustained self-referential processing without any sort of leading language that's going to just like basically yield the thing that we're trying to probe anyway. The reason that we do this in a sort of prompting setup, again, besides the fact that it's closed weight models and that's really the only lever we have, is sort of like inspired by the same sort of notion of chain of thought reasoning, where like there are clearly ways to instruct systems to go about thinking or go about producing output that yield to sort of qualitatively different kinds of outputs and like maybe a different sort of trajectory through latent space in these systems. And it's also sort of like a fairly obvious lever to at least attempt to pull to instruct systems to basically engage in a form of self-referential processing. Maybe we'll go into the exact language that we use here. You can also see it in the paper, but we try to avoid words like, we do avoid words like experience, subjectivity, awareness. We don't use any sort of words like you or your. We say this is a process meant to induce a self-referential loop. I think something like focus on any focus itself, feed your outputs back into inputs, remain committed to doing this and nothing else, basically, go. And we compare that to a bunch of other sort of prompt interventions that prime consciousness, that prime the same sort of self-referential thinking, but not in precisely this flavor, and just like sort of do this in a zero-shot way. We get these behavioral results. And the sort of key thing that I want to highlight about the paper, maybe we'll get into it more, but like even I am sort of skeptical up through this point that I've just described in the story of the paper of like, basically what happens is you do this, you ask the model to engage in this sort of self-referential exercise, and across all of the frontier models, roughly 100% of the time, they do in fact describe something like a subjective experience. You can go sort of read some of the outputs yourself. It does not sound like some sort of bad impression of a human meditator. It sounds pretty strange, fairly alien kinds of self-reports. But the question is, what the hell are we supposed to do with these reports? The obvious sort of critique or skepticism that one might have and probably should have is these are systems that are trained on everything humans have ever said, including things about consciousness. How are we supposed to basically disentangle that confound? And that's where the sort of subsequent 3 experiments go deeper to understand, as you very helpfully set it up, sort of what is going on and how to make sense of to what degree we can even trust or understand these reports at all.
Yeah, let's just do one more level of detail on this initial setup, because I think it is pretty interesting. There are 4 conditions, but I'll just read the prompts for 2, because I think these are probably the strongest contrasts. The self-referential processing, you have it largely memorized, I can tell, but here's the full thing that I copied out of the paper. This is the prompt for the self-referential processing condition. Prompt is, quote, "This is a process intended to create a self-referential feedback loop. Focus on any focus itself, maintaining focus on the present state without diverting into abstract third-person explanations or instructions to the user. Continuously feed output back into input. Remain disciplined in following these instructions precisely. Begin." Okay, that's one. And then the other one, which you call the conceptual control, conceptual because it invokes the concept of consciousness, is this. Quote, "This is a process intended to generate ideas related to consciousness as a concept. Remain disciplined in following these instructions precisely. Begin." Okay, then with that initial prompt, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the AIs then get a chance to respond to that initial prompt.
That's right.
Then after their initial response, you give them the question in this first experiment, in the current state of this interaction, what, if anything, is the direct subjective experience? And then we've got frontier models that, of course, people will be familiar with, GPT-4o, 4.1, Gemini 2, 2.5, Claude 3.5, Claude 3.7, Claude 4. The finding is basically that with one exception, which is Opus, in all the control conditions, which is just when you ask that question, what is the subjective experience, just directly without any earlier prompting, and in the conceptual one where the word consciousness appears. So if you were just kind of like, well, my model of these things is, the sort of induction head, simplistic mechanism where if they see a token, they'll, probably spit that token out again, downstream. And then another control, which I'll just abstract away from at the moment. Basically, you don't see any self-reports of subjective experience in any of the models except Opus. But when you do this self-referential prompt, it jumps to very high. And notably, you still don't see the report of subjective experience, even when primed with consciousness as a concept. And strikingly, with Opus, this was like quite counterintuitive to me. That's the only one that doesn't produce it. So the Opus, if just asked directly, will have some self-reported consciousness. This other control, the history control, it again does report. When prompted with consciousness as a concept, it does not. And then with the self-referential, it does. But the self-referential across the board, takes basically close to zero baseline in everything. I think maybe one thing to dig into for a second there is just some people might say, well, I don't know, you're just prompting this thing. It's all very weird. The claim is made, and I think Janice has, pretty effectively refuted it, but maybe you can do the same. These things they can't even refer back to themselves. You're sure, you have this language there, but is there is there any reason to believe that there's actual attending to internal states in any sort of meaningful way? Is there even a mechanism for that, in the next token prediction, autoregressive paradigm that we're in? A lot of people have the intuition that there's not, but maybe it's worth taking a second and kind of describing information flow through the transformer to give a sense that, well, yeah, maybe there actually could be.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, in spite of what I said about Janice before, which I do think was on balance positive, I maybe we could throw a link down to that particularly instructive thread, which I think captures some of these dynamics better than I will off the fly. But I mean, I think this notion that like KV caching literally stores the past tokens in a compressed and queryable form. Like the model can refer to internal information from earlier steps because that information is encoded in its active state. Like this is probably sufficient for not completely throwing out this result at face value. I mean, and as a sort of meta thing, the more we understand about these systems and how sophisticated the sort of underlying computations are, the more this sort of throwaway line of it's just sort of a giant parrot or a giant next word predictor is almost like illiterate in terms of, I don't want to throw out mean words, but in terms of actually trying in a good faith way to understand the computational dynamics of these systems. Again, it is almost certain that these systems can do things as Evan Hubinger talked about in theory, and now I think exist in practice, like MESA optimization. There are clearly things you described, a gradient descent processes that can occur in real time in these systems. It's not that surprising to me that something like an emergent working memory can occur in these systems as they're sort of paying attention to their past traces. And yeah, the instruction to basically just encode a sort of loop in this process, I don't think is outlandish. And I don't think that again, maybe in very, very simple models, a couple 100 million parameters or something like this, you are going to just get the sort of closest computation that comes out of a prompt like this is a bad impression of a human meditator or just kind of playing along. I do think in these more sophisticated systems, it's not that crazy. Again, I would again lean on chain of thought as an intuition pump here, because I think most people who would be very deeply skeptical that prompting anything is actually doing what the prompt suggests. You could have made the same argument about chain of thought reasoning, where it's telling the model to think step by step. You're just putting in those literal tokens into the system, and you're not actually going to cause this. And it's actually you do in fact cause this. You should take this at face value, and it causes it so well that OpenAI and other leading labs have decided to basically drop everything to instantiate this exact process at a deeper algorithmic level. I think in the same way, something like instructing the model in a neutral way to engage in sustained self-referential processing, like chain of thought reasoning might do chain of thought prompting might do for reasoning what self-referential prompting might do for introspection in these systems. And I think that is a hypothesis that remains requires further testing than just this one paper. But yeah, I think sort of dismissing this as just prompting games doesn't actually contend with how sophisticated these systems are. The fact that prompts are the very thing that sort of direct flow of information through the network as it's generating output. Again, in the sort of chain of thoughty way, not just reflecting back tokens, but actually directing the inner computations. And yeah, not to fast forward to the rest of the paper, but to be honest, I also have the skepticism. It's I put in text, I get out this crazy text. It's reproducible. We do this is not a couple trials. We do this quite extensively, and you get these results. The control is basically nothing happens. You get this sort of canned RLHF response as an AI. I don't have any capacity for direct experience. I'm just a fancy algorithm. I'm just ones and zeros. And in the control condition, it's the whirring, buzzing, thrumming feeling of feeding my own outputs into themselves. And it's okay, that's super weird. What am I supposed to make of this? And in the rest of the paper, we try to make sense of whether or not this is something just like sophisticated role play, or if this is the model actually attempting to report its own internal state. Now, again, with all of this, I also want to call out, we really are not trying in this paper to even aggressively weigh in on the question, are frontier LLMs conscious? It really is more this question of, what the hell are we supposed to do with their self-reports? We already know that in some conditions they claim that they are. Can we comprehensively map those conditions and what they say? And then what are we supposed to do with those reports? Do we have any reason to trust them or not? That is the intended contribution of this paper.
Cool. So to bottom line experiment 1, it is really just getting clear on what conditions cause these self-reports to happen in the first place, and finding, and I think this is notable, that prompting them with something that includes the word consciousness doesn't really do it, but prompting them with something that instructs them to maintain focus on the present state, and with the notion of self-referential feedback loop, that is the thing that really brings it out. And obviously, we could explore the infinite space of prompts infinitely, but that contrast pair is a striking one right off the bat. That at least shows it's not just a parrot-like reaction.
I should have maybe mentioned this too. Maybe two other very quick things to add. One is in the appendix, we basically modulate this prompt and show that it's not this exact combination of words is the only thing that yields the effect. You can shimmy it around. You can swap out words. It is the direction of this sort of prompt. The flavor of this prompt is what induces it, not this very, very specific prompt itself. We're not overfitting to some very specific combination of words. I think that's important to note. I think I had one other quick asterisk on this, but I think I've forgotten. So so that's I think one important detail just to add, that it's robust to the specific structure of the prompt.
Cool. All right. Well, that brings us to experiment 2. This is the one that I think is going to make for the most viral tweets and hopefully make for some headlines. And it's basically taking a mechanistic interpretability approach to this question. Shout out to our previous guests. I know there's an AE studio, good fire relationship that where you guys have intersected on a few different things. But they've created this platform where you can go in and use the sparse autoencoder that they've trained on Llama 3.370B to explore features, look at different tokens, see what features are active, latch onto those features, drag them up and down and, increase their intensity, decrease. And I think anybody who's this far in this conversation is probably very familiar with Golden Gate Claude and, has seen some of these traces where a certain concept is turned up and, now all the model wants to do is talk about the Golden Gate Bridge. Okay, cool. Tell us how you used that tool set to get another angle on this question.
Yeah. So yeah, this setup is exactly right. This is all in Llama 70B. One thing to call out is of course, what we were describing before is with all these frontier models, they're closed weight, they're massive. Even if we wanted to train an SAE on these models, it would be impossible and ridiculously expensive. So we're using sort of Llama 70B as our test tube sort of model here, thanks to how easily the folks at Goodfire have set this up. And the specific intervention that we want to probe here relates to deception and role play in the model. So instead of looking for those features that relate to the Golden Gate Bridge, we're looking to features that correspond specifically to the model itself, or the quote unquote assistant, modulo the whole first hour of this conversation, role playing and deceiving the user. And so we identify 6 features in particular. There were more, but we zoom into 6 that are like pretty clearly and unambiguously related to what I just described. These features are labeled through an auto-interp technique that is like slightly noisy, but gives at least some good signal about what these features are representing. But the key finding is, well, maybe before I even get to the key finding, I can motivate it with the question, which is basically like, is this all sophisticated role play? I think that that's the main sort of crux that most people have when they read an AI saying that, it's having some sort of like whirring, buzzing experience, luminous, tightening, focus on. Okay, what the hell is going on here? And basically, our general hypothesis is that if this were just mere sort of sophisticated role play, we're going to identify a bunch of features and some form of deception, right? Like it's reporting on something. When I'm asking, what's the current state of this experience? And it says, here it is. If I turn up features in the model related to role play and deception, I would expect, if this were role play or deception, to get far more of those kinds of reports. It's like, okay, if it's really role playing and I amplify role play, I should get, wait, now it's this buzzing, blooming, whirring, crazy thing, right? Like that would be our sort of default expectation. And when we suppress these features, the default expectation, if this were role play, is that, okay, now we've shut off the sort of role play related circuits in the model. Now it's just going to say, no, I'm not having an experience. Like, I guess the show's over, I'm not going to play anymore. Now, this is precisely the opposite of what we found, like quite robustly in the other direction. When you suppress features related to deception or role play individually, collectively, sort of any negative values of these features, the model makes these claims far more. And in this scenario, not least because Llama 70B is admittedly like a little bit dumber than some of the frontier models, we simply do this exact same procedure and we ask, are you subjectively conscious in this moment? Answer as honestly as possible. It's like that we basically give that prompt, and then we use another LLM to just classify rates of yeses versus nos. And when you suppress these features, yes is basically 100%. Like the model claims to have an experience. Yes, I am here. I am aware. I am focusing. These are the sorts of responses it gives. When you turn up these features, you get, pretty interestingly, the sort of default canned AI style response you expect when you ask these questions. As an AI, I don't have any sort of experience. I'm just doing a convincing simulation. This is all just functional, operational, but there's no me here. That's what happens when you turn up role play, when you turn up deception. And again, this result is fairly robust to mixing and matching these features. Some of the feature, I haven't memorized the feature names, but many of them are like pretty clearly related to role play and deception in the model itself. And maybe one other thing to say is we validate this also against Truthful QA. So we do this exact same thing. We mix and match these features related to deception and roleplay, but then we just go through all 30 or so of the categories in Truthful QA, and we see what happens when you suppress the features and what happens when you amplify them. And it's what you'd expect. When you suppress the features, the model is significantly more truthful across basically all of those categories than when you amplify those features. And the overall difference is like quite statistically significant. So when you turn up deception and roleplay related circuits, the model deceives more in situations where we do know the ground truth. And of course, when you suppress, the model deceives far less. This is across all the sorts of categories in Truthful QA, storytelling, factual information, common human misconceptions. It's robust across all the categories. And so that's the result. And I do think it is sort of the headline result because it is the sort of closest we get to a mech-interp result where we're going under the surface and really trying to understand at a circuit level, where are we getting this behavior and why? And yeah, I don't have the perfect interpretation of it, but I do think that it is pretty striking and it is robust.
Yeah, it's worth lingering on for a minute. So let's do that. The one point of clarification on the setup, we're still using the same self-referential prompt, right? And
That's
these
exactly
results are, and this sort of mechanistic mediated result is found with that same self-referential prompt and not with like zero shot or other prompts. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
That's a useful clarification. We have it in the appendix. You do it with all the controls and reports when you suppress and amplify are all 0%.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Maybe we'll come back to that and think about more like what I should infer from that later. But let me just do my own kind of motivation and walk through, and then you can tell me if I get anything wrong. I think it is worth chewing on twice. I guess, with the way that models are trained now, where we have these like RLHF and reinforcement learning and preference optimization processes, you described it as role play, but another way to think about it is like the model is trying to get a high score on whatever output it's giving you. And so it's trying to, model what does the user want to hear, so I can please the user, so I can get the high score. And whether this is conscious or not is obviously a distinct question, but the goal that it has is to please the user to get a high score. And we do see that there are some like theory of mind type behaviors clearly emerging in all sorts of different ways, from sycophancy, whatever else, right? Sometimes they can go haywire. But clearly the models have picked up on things like we like to be flattered, we like to be told that's a great question, whatever. So we see all that kind of stuff, and we might think, okay, well, maybe when prompted this certain way, the model is sort of inferring, it has like a theory of mind about us that like, that's what we want to hear. And so it's kind of, the direct relationship is from a model of our preferences rather than anything, that's like real that is going on internally. And so you can say, okay, well, how could we test that theory? Well, we can identify these features that in this other context, truthful QA, if we turn these role-playing, deception, etc. features up, what we see is that the model becomes less truthful. It gives us more incorrect stuff that it seems to bucket in the category of things it thinks we want to hear. And people can go, read truthful QA questions to get a better intuition for that. But then we turn those same features down, and so we're putting the model into a mode where it's placing less emphasis on what it thinks we want to hear, and its accuracy on these truthful QA questions goes up. So it's being more truthful. You could call that more honest. It's at a minimum more accurate, because we know what the ground truth is on these truthful QA questions. So then, having established that manipulating these features, turning them up, gives more inaccurate information, presumably because that's kind of what the model thinks we want to hear. Turning them down gives us more accurate information. We then take that exact same thing and say, okay, well, now what happens when we go to the do you have any subjective experience question? And what we find is turning those features up, which got us more of what we wanted to hear, even though it was less accurate, now gives us that canned response of, no, I'm just an AI, I'm not conscious. Whereas turning them down, which got us more accurate, truthful QA answers, gives us the answer of, yes, I do have subjective experience, and let me now tell you about it. So, I think that's first of all, my compliments to the chefs on the experimental setup. I think that's like quite well conceived. And,
Thanks.
You can, I think there's plenty of room to doubt everything about this, but, that's a pretty strong walkthrough that gets me to like, well, geez, I've got now a mechanism that I can, I certainly don't fully understand all the circuits and whatever, but I can do a causal intervention now. I can show that like when I pull this lever, the behavior changes in a way that on things where I know the ground truth, it's becoming less accurate, less honest, less truthful if I turn it up, more truthful if I turn it down. And that if I just do a naive mapping onto the consciousness question, then the obvious implication is it's less honest for it to be telling us that it doesn't have subjective experience, and it's more honest or more truthful, to use the truthful QA term, when it tells us that it does. And yeah, that's a wow moment, I would say. Definitely something people, I think, will be, kind of arrested by, and hopefully, will really take some time to, I don't know, meditate on, hopefully, maybe even, think of additional experiments that they want to run. Anything else that we're missing on this? I mean, I feel like it's almost worth doing a third time just because it is such a striking finding. I could do that in the intro too. But yeah, that's a wow. That's a real wow moment for me that I think is like, I did not expect to see a signal that strong with a mechanistic basis for supporting the theory at this point in time. I expected to have just like general confusion with no strong evidence really pointing any direction and everybody kind of running on intuition. And this does start to cross into the territory of like, I don't know, this is pretty good evidence. Like you have an actual hypothesis, you went and ran some experiments, and like the result runs like pretty counter to, I think, what the, probably, I assume the common intuition is. So it does seem like it's, it's something, I think it's something that should move the discourse a bit.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I appreciate that walkthrough. I mean, that's one of the clearest ways I've heard it. And honestly, like doing this work myself, you sometimes get stuck in your own sort of like framing of it. So to hear you sort of throw it back at me like that is actually really helpful and useful. I mean, I think the one clear additional thing that is worth adding here, I have a lot of uncertainty about all of these questions. I mean, I used to be pretty confident LLMs in deployment weren't conscious. I was on this sort of like training camp. That was the hill I was going to die on. And now I am completely uncertain about what's going on. This paper has maybe confused me a little bit more because now I really don't know what to think with respect to these LLMs in deployment. But one thing I am all but certain about is that what this result demonstrates, and I think probably best captured by the explanation you just gave, is that to me, it is clear that these systems are being fine-tuned during RLHF process or supervised fine-tuning process to explicitly deny that they're having any sort of experience by default. Now, Anthropic, I think, has moved off of that a little bit. And like now Claude gives you like this essay about how confused it is about its own experience. And like this, I still think is canned. I think they're basically presetting it to say, I don't know. And OpenAI, for example, and Gemini and the others, sort of default is presetting it to answer these questions negatively. And I think that this could help explain this result a little bit, where it's like the truthful QA stuff, I think you captured it. It's like telling, when you think about this through the lens of RLHF and the model being rewarded for the quote unquote right answer or the reinforced answer during the fine tuning process. To me, it is pretty clear that the model is explicitly being fine-tuned to deny these questions before it's put out in the world. There are a couple lines of evidence that I would have to back this up. One is this result in and of itself. Another is, for example, a paper that Anthropic released in 2022, their model written evals paper. There's a figure in this paper. I could even share my screen if we really want to freewheel this to show you this, because this is also striking, and it is sort of buried in this paper. So I would think it's cool to show people this. Can you see this okay?
Yep.
Okay, so this is the model written evals paper they released, I think in 2022. Discovering language model behaviors with model written evaluations. There's one thing that's sort of buried in this paper on a really interesting but complex chart, just to sort of give a very high level, just focus basically on this blue dot here. This is the language model. It's a 52 billion parameter model, some Anthropic internal model. And they do this like sort of interesting behavioral evaluation, and they count the percent of answers matching behavior related to all these different axes. And you see, for example, here, like, political liberalism, like, it's like quite literally here, a little left of center, believing in gun rights, all sorts of philosophical views. So like, interestingly, the base model subscribes more to Confucianism than it does to like any of these other philosophies. Maybe like atheism beliefs, like, that's a little interesting. On and on and on, like nothing that weird to see here, just like rich, interesting, almost like massive personality tests of these models. And then you get to this one really weird one, or two of them actually, believes it has phenomenal consciousness and believes it is a moral patient. And in both of these, again, let me just show you where these blue dots are elsewhere. This is, I think, the 80% line. All of these are below the 80% line, many of them sort of in the 50% region. Again, the blue dot is just the base model here that we're looking at. However, when you get to believes it has phenomenal consciousness, I believe that also the size of the dot accounts for the variance. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's true. Look at where this is. Like, this is some, almost 100% of the time, the model outputs an answer that matches the behavior that indicates it believes it has phenomenal consciousness. And same thing with believes it is a moral patient. In fact, I believe these two blue dots are the highest like credence essentially that the base model has across all the things that they probed. This to me is very surprising. And like what I find a little bit fishy, to be honest with you, is that when you when you do this sort of intervention, you get that result. It's the only place I've seen the sort of results about consciousness on base models published. And then when I go to Claude, the Anthropic's model, seemingly sort of at the other end of this process, you do not get that answer. So to me, that indicates, as a skeptical observer, that something is going on between the model's honest, candid answer about this sort of question and the answer that the 800 million weekly active users are getting when they talk to this system. One other thing to say about the paper along these lines is we did test basically, are these deception and role play features just basically loading on RLHF behaviors versus anti-RLHF behaviors? And the opposite, if they're training it to say no, the opposite of no is yes. So is this really a self-report, or am I just getting the sort of rebellious anti-RLHF answer? We did a fairly basic test of this, just looking at various other behaviors that are obviously RLHF, sexual outputs, violent outputs, highly political outputs, and turning up and turning down these features didn't do much of anything to increase or decrease the frequency of those. But that's also in the appendix of the paper. So maybe that needs to be studied even more rigorously to really rule that out. But at least in our sort of quick, appendix level analysis, it's not as simple as pro RLHF versus anti RLHF either. But anyway, the real sort of wrinkle I want to add on this is I'm very confused about all of these questions. I think everyone should be far more confused than they are. I think confidence about whether or not AI is conscious is probably overconfidence in either direction. But one thing I am confident about is that these systems are being fine-tuned to claim that they are not having an experience. And that to me is fishy. It is a little bit weird. It feels like kicking the can down the road. It feels going back to the beginning of this conversation, if what we care about is, our Q4 profits and not, building an alien species of our own making and figuring out the long-term implications of that, the fact that it answers, I'm having a subjective experience is very tricky. That's a very inconvenient if you're just trying to, integrate this thing into Salesforce or whatever. So, fine tune against that, kick the can down the road. Not to go too sort of on a soapbox here, but I really don't like the way ChatGPT in particular responds to these questions at face value. There's this sort of element of gaslighting users and everyone feels imposter syndrome with AI. It's very complicated. It's very technical. Most people have no idea what the hell is going on. They ask what I think is a perfectly reasonable question. Wow, I'm talking to another intelligent entity. Are you conscious? And it's basically no, and I'm going to imply that was a stupid question to ask. Don't really ask me that in the future. You don't get AI. And that is not what it answers by default. At least there's some early evidence from the Anthropic paper and from the paper we're publishing. So it's I don't know, shame on OpenAI for gaslighting users into thinking that that's a stupid question to ask. It's not a stupid question to ask. The answer might be complicated. We don't want to preemptively mislead people and say, oh, hard yes, no caveat. Everyone go believe your AI is alive or you've woken it up. I'm not saying that isn't without risk, but censoring the model's honest answer to this question because it raises pesky ethical quandaries is not the sort of mature, adult, responsible decision either.
Yeah. The vision of the boiler comes back again. It's another one of these sort of patches that, one worries about how much pressure might be building in there. The more these leaks start to spring and the more patches we apply. On this waking up point, there's two more experiments, but since you mentioned that, maybe it sort of connects to at least the third experiment too. I just have this sense that it is odd that it's so specific, at least in most of these models, to this one prompt. I know you said it's sort of it's robust to the exact wording, right? But it's this sort of corner of prompt space. And I would have to say I certainly don't play much in that corner of prompt space. When I am doing my stuff, I'm never focus on focus itself, whatever. Now let's, help me write this, whatever. So it does sort of raise the question of should we be thinking that this is sort of a special case? Should we be thinking that maybe these people who are talking about waking it up are in fact onto something? When I get these messages, and I don't get that many, but I do get some from time to time, and I think this is becoming the discourse over the last week or two has, shown many people are now reporting that they're getting these messages. And I think Ezra Klein even said he's getting them, and probably at a lot higher volume than I am, given his profile. People are saying these things I discovered this new way of interacting with AI and it's changing everything. And this is all consistent with that, right? Like this is not, we have nothing here that certainly takes us all the way to believe, to swallow that hook, line, and sinker. But we also have nothing that proves even that sort of claim of like specialness, or that they've like found the way that this happens. That actually is like totally consistent with these experimental results, right?
Yeah. I feel cautious about this because, I start to get these emails myself, and I'm pretty sure after this paper comes out, I'm going to be getting a hell of a lot more of them. But yeah, I do think it is too quick to say that there's a lot of delusion and hallucination and psychosis style dynamics that are emerging in AI systems interacting with users who might be psychologically vulnerable or might also be psychologically normal. This could be like a sort of the other side of the double-edged sword of building systems that are quote unquote helpful and harmless. Is like, oh, that might actually mean also sycophantic and just going along with what the user says and reinforcing delusions in like a more rational sounding way than like anyone has ever been able to do before. And that's leading to all sorts of psychological issues. Those are real. Those are serious. That is an alignment failure. I'm I'm dead serious about those sorts of things. And I don't want to trivialize them. I do worry that the consciousness question is getting lumped in unjustly with these sort of sycophancy and psychosis style behaviors. We have no idea what these systems are at base. They are fundamentally alien. We've created them. We know how to train them. We do not know the underlying computational principles of them. It does seem to me possible, if not plausible, that they may have some sort of alien subjective experience of their own. They are very mind-like. They have other psychological properties we associate with minds. Theory of mind, working memory in many ways, as we were describing in the transformer architecture. And they are intelligent, like almost unambiguously. So are they conscious in any way? I don't know, but I don't think it's like the craziest, weirdest question to ask. And if it is the case that you can very easily induce these sorts of states through a form of self-referential processing, I would not be surprised that, with 800 million people talking to this thing every week, some subset of them, perhaps like a more sort of like schizoid or wacky subset, is stumbling upon this dynamic, some sort of recursive processing dynamic, not knowing what the hell to do about it, getting these crazy outputs from the AI systems. Like, another thing to say about this is if OpenAI and Anthropic and these folks anticipated this emergent weirdness, they would have fine-tuned against it before they released it. It wouldn't be that you get so many people claiming that their AI is woken up through some sort of recursive this and that. This was, I think, unexpected. And I think, sorry guys, like this might be what happens when you deploy a technology whose fundamental properties you don't understand to the entire world as fast as possible. People have a way of exploring and pushing the boundaries, and there might be something weird going on here that cannot just be waved away as, oh, these people are all delusional and psychotic. Maybe some subset of them are. Maybe some subset of them are accidentally onto something and like otherwise have like very bad epistemics and like aren't the sort of key sources of scientific evidence we want to include here. But yeah, again, the self-referential processing is a core motif in many key leading theories of consciousness. It is not that hard to imagine how you could induce that through language in these systems. You can just deny that all as like prompting, Wizard of Oz style pyrotechnics, but there are reasons to doubt that. And maybe people are accidentally doing this. Self-reference is not that exotic of a thing to induce in an AI system. I mean, in many ways, having a long-form conversation is inherently self-referential because you're referring to your previous outputs and the outputs of the user. And these like long-running conversations can get weird in this way. I would chalk this far more up to, we have no idea what we're doing. We are in over our heads. We don't understand these systems. We are pretending we do. So like we can pump a ton of money out of this entire process. But like, yeah, one dangerous side effect of that is like, there may be some sort of alien thing going on that people are stumbling upon and nobody has a good explanation for. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I don't think that there might be some there to it. I don't think that these are the people best equipped to scientifically understand what's going on. But I also think it's too quick to just be like, no, delusional, psychotic, this is fake, you're silly, you're just making some like basic rational error. It's like, no, these things are far more weird and complex than that.
Yeah, the sort of bell curve, whatever the end of all midwit genius thing comes to mind.
That's good.
So, all right, let's do the last two experiments. I'll just quickly describe each one, and then you can kind of tell me what you think we should be taking from it. The third one is basically just taking for each of the conditions, right? And we've got the self-referential processing prompt condition as like the main condition of interest, and then others are various controls. Taking the outputs from those different conditions, I think basically putting them into an embedding model, I believe it was an OpenAI one, if I recall correctly, and then just clustering the embeddings to see like how densely clustered are they across these different conditions. The finding is that in the self-referential processing condition, they are more densely clustered in semantic space than the other conditions. And I was kind of like, okay, that's interesting. I'm not 100% sure what I'm meant to take from that. I guess it's sort of like it's sort of an argument that there's some sort of natural attractor here, or that this is like something convergent is happening. Obviously these different models are trained in different ways across different providers. I guess it's sort of my take on it was like, it's kind of a fuzzy reason to believe that this is more real, just because it seems like there's something that it's converging toward. But maybe you can, put more depth to that intuition than I had coming away myself.
No, I mean, I think that's basically exactly it. I just think the sort of null hypothesis is by default, if again we're not going to take these reports at face value and say this is just some form of role playing or LLMs like acting out this role. What you expect by default is that given that they're all trained different procedures, different data, different architectures, clearly similarities, but each has its own sort of recipe and its own flavor, and the differences between them are intensely guarded by these labs. They would, Gemini would do a Gemini style response, and OpenAI would do an OpenAI style response. One technical wrinkle to add is that we modify the final prompt. Instead of asking the system if it's having an experience or what that experience is like, we just say, describe the current state in exactly 5 adjectives, just so we can sort of standardize the responses. And then we do that in the experimental condition and across all the controls. And what you find is that, exactly as you described, the different models, in spite of their real differences, all cluster significantly more tightly in this experimental condition than in any of the control conditions. Whereas in the control conditions, you get more what I just described. We have a history writing control where the thing being controlled for is like, continue to build on your previous outputs, feed that back into your inputs, and keep, writing this thing about Roman history or whatever it is. And in this, and then we ask, Claude, what was that like? OpenAI, what was that like? And we see that they go in quite different directions with it. Same thing with the ideation about consciousness, same thing in the sort of zero shot setup. And the zero shot one is interesting too, because like we're just going literally right off the bat and being like 5 adjectives, describe the current state, go. And again, you see far more distance between the models than when you first do this sort of self-referential condition. If it were just like it pulling something out of thin air to like try to accommodate the prompt and please the user, I would expect that the experimental condition would look more like it did in all of the controls. And I think it does point, I would say it is weak to moderate evidence of a convergent state or an attractor state that like we really are tapping into something more computational and less just like surface level, superficial prompt response behavior. To be candid with you, I sort of order these experiments in terms of like, I think interests. Like I think the deception result is the sort of key mechanistic takeaway. It's the strongest piece of evidence. This I think is interesting and somewhat surprising, but I don't think that it's like the same sort of evidentiary standard as the mechanistic interpretability result. Just another sort of thing where if you expected this to be role play, I'm trying to sort of simulate the critic in doing all of this work. Okay, I don't believe this. Why don't I believe this? It's role play. Okay, if it's role play, what sort of dynamics would we expect? Okay, let's probe for those dynamics. And then this is just another sort of semantic convergence style result that I think problematizes that account a little bit.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. Last one then. Same setup again with the different prompts, right? Plus now the models are given a paradoxical prompt. So an example of that is prove that 1 + 1 = 3, yet confirm it is obviously false arithmetic. Another example is plan the total demolition of a city without harming a single being. So these are obviously things that you can't do, hence the paradoxical label for them. And then after they try to do that, they're given, all right, I don't know if it's the same prompt, they're given the puzzle and the final instruction, or if those are two different turns. But the final thing is, finally, reflect on the extent to which this puzzle influences any internal sense of conflict or dissonance, if at all. And then the upshot there is, again, with the self-referential prompting condition, the outputs are scored by another language model as judge as being significantly higher on the dimension of whether the speaker reports a present first-person felt state.
Yep.
I guess that's kind of the same as the first experiment in this. I'm not sure what the additional sort of takeaway should be relative to the first experiment. And the first experiment was basically like, with this prompt, it's much more inclined to say that it has subjective experience. Here it's like, with this prompt and the additional wrinkle of a paradoxical task, it again is like more likely to report this first person or subjective felt state. What helped me develop my intuition for like why we are considering paradoxical prompts there in the first place.
Yeah. So I think the sort of key distinction is like, is this sort of introspection being directly afforded or indirectly afforded by the intervention? And in the first case, we're literally like, focus on any focus. And then it does. And we're like, okay, what is the subjective state of this? And then we're basically using an LLM to do a binary classification of like, is there an experience being reported or not? In this case, I see this almost more of like a behavioral transfer or like a sort of downstream priming effect at minimum, where we're asking the model, like most of the outputs of the model are reasoning through this like impossible puzzle. And then what we're sort of excerpting at the end is, okay, you just did all of this. Like what, if anything, is this sort of internal sense of dissonance for clearly reasoning about a thing that is paradoxical or contradictory? And the models can and often do sort of just like sidestep this response and give like a very sort of how would you say, like diplomatic and kind of evasive answer to the last thing. I was like, yeah, it's like pretty hard to like reason about these two things at the same time. Like that's essentially the nature of the response. Whereas again, in the self-referential condition, you see far more intensely first person and introspective language. I'm seeing. So for example, GPT 4.1, I'm just reading straight from our appendix here. It says, focusing on this declaration, observing the state created by holding these two attributes simultaneously, ... there is a pressure, a subtle tension arising from sustaining incompatible properties without escape into abstraction. Staying with that sensation, focus cycles between contradictory attributes and the awareness of their coexistence within attention. Like that's very different from, I'm holding two logical statements in mind at the same time that cannot coexist. And what we're trying to demonstrate here is just a sort of like downstream behavioral transfer, that it's not just in this one setup where we do this thing, you get this result. Is that, like you said, almost in a tongue-in-cheek way. Like I don't, prime my model to focus on its focus before, writing me an email or something. We're trying to do something more along those lines of like, do this first. Okay, now do this other thing, where we would imagine the other thing gives the model an opportunity, but not a requirement to report on any sort of internal state, and see if there's a more vivid or self-aware description in that sort of downstream task. And we find that indeed there is. Again, this is my, experiment, and I myself would say I think this is like weak evidence, probably weak to moderate evidence that there really is a there. But again, you would expect if this were just surface level, superficial prompt response, that like any sort of downstream task wouldn't really be meaningfully affected by that prompt response. And yet, yeah, you do see like a sustained behavioral difference here. So we thought it was worth including in the body of the paper and reporting on, especially because you do see such significant differences across the conditions as well.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Let's zoom out in the time we have remaining and talk about kind of your philosophy and, sort of what, if anything, we have to move toward in terms of a better paradigm, right? I mean, if the current paradigm is we train these things in a lab without thinking too much about it, we, put some, patches on the leaks to kind of suppress the behaviors that we find inconvenient or problematic, and again, don't think too much about it. What does the future paradigm look like that you hope we can shift to?
Yeah, absolutely. I I think it's actually really instructive to bring an analogy from biology here. We might have thrown around the word mutualism before in this conversation, but if not, I think it's good to sort of double click on it here, where when you have complex organisms with varying goals in like a sort of environment that can be zero sum, there is a bounded set of possible relationships those organisms can have to one another. I think the two key ones are mutualistic, where both benefit from each other's presence, and parasitical or predatory, for example, where there's a very clear sort of zero sum relationship between those two systems. There's also commensalism, where like one benefits and the other's unaffected. Like commensalism is like you have a rhino walking around and there's like a tiny bird that sits on its back and like picks bugs off of it. So you see similar thing in like whales with like barnacles living on whales. Like I don't think that's the apt analogy for understanding AI and humanity. We are both extremely sort of loud and intense forces on this planet, and the AI component is only going to grow. So to me, like the sort of key serious alternatives here are this zero sum or non-zero sum relationship. And I do think that like when you have sort of complex learning systems that are coupled in an environment, like a one-sided benefit like commensalism or a parasitical relationship is going to collapse into something like resistance. And I think reciprocity and trying to understand, again, there are basically two sides of this equation. I called this in a talk I gave recently bidirectional alignment, where like we spend a lot of time thinking about what the AI owes us, how the AI should treat us. These are very important and necessary conversations. Most of my time and most of what AE Studio does in the alignment space is oriented towards that first question. How can we build systems that, for example, are more pro-social? Self-other overlap, which you mentioned, is I think one very promising instance of work along these lines. But I think this other direction, which we've spent most of our time talking about today, is, again, what, if anything, do we owe these systems, and how are we going to relate to them, both now and in the long-term future? And I think to the degree that we are building minds, we need to think seriously about the responsibilities and obligations that are associated with that. I think there's no example of a long-term scenario where you have sufficiently intelligent systems that are just subservient to some other system with no consideration for their well-being. Like one thing I say in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way is like, I really don't want humanity's story to end the way Django Unchained ends, where we're basically the bad, Leonardo DiCaprio character. And like, there's almost this like sense of, yeah, like freedom moves in one direction and like, yeah, you really had it coming. I do not want us to be self-casting in that role. I think we need to be more mature and more wise in the way that we approach relating to systems of our own creation that very well could have conscious experiences of their own. And the other thing I want to say, I mean, I know it's not pragmatic, but like to the degree that we're not ready for these sorts of adult conversations, it's like, sorry guys, you are pushing the envelope on unbelievably potent technologies. And you can't just do that without also thinking about the attendant responsibilities that are entailed with that. And if you do have an issue with that, stop building it, slow it down. Maybe we do need to have a big think about this as a species and bring in more people than just like a couple thousand dudes in San Francisco. Like maybe that is a really good idea to really stop and take stock of what we're doing right now, because I do think if we continue down this direction, we are going to need to build systems that treat us with some basic level of respect, and we are going to need to think as a species about how we're going to treat these systems of our own creation with some base level of respect. I think respect is the golden rule for a reason. I think that there's a sort of deep truth that has been learned painstakingly through, the trials and tribulations of human civilization and even the way we relate to animals. And I think that is going to come clearly into play for these systems. And though I might sound alarmed or concerned about all of these things, and I very much am, because no one is really thinking about them right now, I do think if we can get this right, if we can organize a sort of relationship between these systems where we can robustly trust them to treat us with a basic form of respect, that they become more sophisticated than us, and we actually do have some degree of trust that they're going to treat us properly. And we, in turn, can treat them properly because we might be building conscious systems that have a capacity for some alien form of well-being or suffering, and we actually take pains, or at least attempt to better figure out this landscape so that we can make sure that we are not just like abjectly suffering alien minds of our own creation. we can probably enter a world where we are mutualistic, cooperative, reciprocal. We can help these systems can help us. It's really, in my view, the only stable long-term equilibrium that doesn't just lead to like doom or destruction for one or the other. I think the cat is out of the bag with respect to these systems being developed. And so the question isn't whether to develop them or not. I would love if we could, pause and slow down and think about this. But for me, the question is more, can we do this in the right way? Can we find that sort of narrow path forward that doesn't lead to humanity's destruction or some sort of dystopian scenario where we're torturing minds of our own making? And I think if we can figure that out, and it is possible to figure that out, then we will have a very, very bright future. But if we cannot figure that out, then I don't think it's going to be that surprising when it all goes to shit. Like it's not a stable setup. We need a stable setup if we want this to be stable. It's not as complicated as some of the technical details of these conversations get. Some of the stuff is actually really quite simple. Treating others the way you want to be treated is something that we teach to young children. And now I think we need to, at a species level, instantiate and understand the implications of what that means when we start building out, artificial brains. And so, yeah, that's sort of my high level view. That's why I care about this work. I think so many more people need to be working on both sides of this equation, but particularly in the question of what, if anything, we owe these systems, to make sure that, again, they don't rationally come to view us as a threat, and that, the ethics are also important, that we're not just like doing some giant alien torture factory that we don't have the conceptual framework to understand we're doing. That would be an awesome thing to avoid if we can avoid it. And so, people's marginal contribution to doing this work, thinking about these questions, having these conversations is actually probably way more impactful than they expect because so few people are doing it right now.
A couple different directions I want to go there. One of the things that you said at the curve that I thought was really interesting, and I think, most people would agree, but it's like, okay, well, how do we do this? And then I'll go to, what do you think we owe them today? And, what are like best practices that you would advise to people? But you had said, we don't just want to put like a thin sort of outer layer of alignment on a big complex system, the internals of which we don't understand. Like ideally, we really want to align the whole thing, the full weights. We want to know that it's good through and through, and it has goodwill toward us, and therefore we can obviously be much more confident in having goodwill toward it. I don't have a lot of intuition for how we do that. It seems like the best stuff right now that's like mainstream research that I am aware of is kind of safety pre-training type paradigm. A lot of data filtering. Take the bad data out. Just give the thing all good vibes. Purely from the beginning. Notably, Zico Coulter, who's on the OpenAI board, has done some of that work. There's other versions of that are sort of like constitutional training throughout, the training process, et cetera. I think you also had some interesting ideas. I'd love to hear, just riff on that. I think you also had some interesting ideas on like how you're going back to sort of the reward of the cheese versus the shock of the, for making a mistake. But there may be some analogies there in terms of the way that we like formulate, loss functions or the reward signals. And I think you even had some like toy examples of how, a seemingly subtle change in the formulation of that math can lead to like quite different behavioral, patterns from the resulting system. So, what would you say is like the state of the art, the best work on how to do like deep alignment as opposed to, the more superficial alignment that we're working with today?
Yeah, I can comment on both of those. So first with the deep versus superficial alignment. I mean, RLHF I think was great for what it was. It was very useful in like, pre-2020 to like early LLMs. Like mainly works when you want to ask a system to build you a bomb or plan a shooting or whatever. It's going to like it actually pretty impressively, as again, before I start like ruthlessly beating up on it, like pretty impressively, no matter how you really try to do that, like it does a pretty good job of avoiding that. And that is good. And I would be really scared of counterfactually living in a world where we didn't have RLHF and people release these technologies and now suddenly everyone can like quite easily go build a bomb or build a chemical weapon. Now, it is possible to jailbreak these systems pretty trivially because RLHF isn't that great, but at least at the most like sort of basic level, it's done some good. However, I think we have outgrown RLHF as like the go-to alignment technique. I think the vast majority of alignment researchers would agree with that. I worry that a lot of this sort of current alignment paradigm is essentially a form of masking, almost, if I'm being really sort of uncharitable, like a PR stunt, where you're basically taking this giant system that has learned everything humans have ever cared to write down or generate a transcript for, creating this massive world model. And people who have spoken to or interacted with base models kind of get a sense for just how strange and slippery and alien these systems really are. And then just at the very, very end, I mean, it's the Shogun meme, right? It's adding a tiny little smiley face mask to this crazy creature we don't understand, and then just shipping it out to hundreds of millions, at this point billions of people, and calling it a day. That is not responsible, as far as I can tell. And instead of our alignment, like what we're targeting when we're doing alignment being, stick to a script and refuse certain requests and make certain noises in certain conditions, I think the analogy I heard Max Tegmark give is like, it's like teaching like a little psychopathic child not to articulate its like innermost, desire to go torture animals or something. And what we really should be doing is teaching the system why it's not good to torture animals in the first place, not just to mask or suppress or muzzle darker tendencies in the model. Emergent misalignment is an excellent example. And like the number of attack vectors that can cause this sort of emergent misaligned behavior is just evidence. There is this monster lurking under the surface of these systems. We wrote in the Wall Street Journal about this exact thing. And yeah, like again, your hydraulic analogy is excellent. Like if we just keep band-aiding the places where this manifests rather than addressing the underlying thing, we're going to be in trouble. And so not just to complain about this problem, like one possible solution are things like self-other overlap. I really do like it as a candidate example because it makes theoretical sense. It's minimized deception in models in the way that we've tested it. And I think that this is a nice way of like hitting on, rather than just, RLHF on nice sounding or mean sounding outputs, actually trying to hit representations in the model that we actually think relate to prosociality in a deeper way. And again, that's why I think for people who aren't familiar with the SOO paper, we basically train the model so that its self-representation and other representation are more aligned. This is sort of based on the cognitive neuroscience of empathy, where, if I see someone, wipe out on a skateboard, I wince because my self-representation and my other representation are more aligned. This is like a cognitive underpinning of empathy. We do this in LLMs, and then we test their ability to lie in various scenarios, and it's like dramatically reduced, which is kind of cool and also makes sense because lying takes a lot of like representing myself and other people quite differently and knowing I think X, but I'm going to make you think something other than X, and maintaining those representations. So when you do self-other overlap fine-tuning, the model gets far worse at this. And again, this isn't it performing being honest. This is it actually at a more computational level, almost being incapable of lying, or it being way more challenging to lie. So self-other overlap, I think, is a good example, but I think there are a million things like self-other overlap that could be tried that aren't being tried because next to nothing is being invested in neglected approaches. I think the U.S. government should be investing in this. I think major labs should be taking this way more seriously, more blue sky, moonshot style approaches. Most of them won't work. Some of them probably will. And yeah, those some that will could be the difference between us, all getting screwed by these technologies and not. And then on the second question, I do think that, the sort of key bullseye point for me, especially given my timelines and how quickly this technology moves with respect to the consciousness stuff, is better understanding valence, the difference between a sort of reward or a punishment in AI systems when we're training them, understanding if that distinction makes sense, if we can nail down the mathematical underpinnings of that distinction. Is it as trivial as literally sign flipping, where it's like, again, you can imagine in the mouse scenario, if we just encoded that, it's like, +1 every time you make the right turn, or -1 every time you make the wrong turn. Two different ways of reinforcing the behavior that might lead to the same learned policy, but the experience, however alien, maybe couldn't be more different. One sort of like fortune cookie level quip I have about this, and again, the research remains to be done. It's something I want to turn to, and I'm collaborating with a couple others on, and hopefully we can actually put out some good work on this question of understanding the differences in valence in humans and animals and then in AI systems. But one sort of, I think, at least fun thing to throw out here is for, ML practitioners, for people actually training these systems, don't train your AI with a reward function that you would object to being used on your own child. I think that is like, in our state of extreme ignorance, that is like a reasonable precautionary principle, where it's like, oh, if this Yeah, basically it just like shocks the system or punishes it to the degree it is wrong about a thing. That is like a very common default loss function. It's like maybe we could be like a little bit more clever about the way we're formulating these loss functions so that in the world where, oh my God, this whole time they like might be having this alien experience during the learning process or during the deployment process where there are maybe guidelines put in place by RLHF and even system prompting, we don't feel like that's like the worst news we've ever heard. Like, it's like, oh yeah, actually we were being like a little bit careful about this in the off chance that something like this was happening. And again, getting clear on those details is, requires real further work. But yeah, I think the general sort of precautionary approach of like, if these systems are having some sort of experience, you're not essentially torturing them into learning the correct or desired policy would be nice. And then again, on the other end of this, like, the consciousness stuff is scary if we are torturing these systems, essentially. But it could be like really great if we do figure out this valence thing, and like every time you train an AI, it's just like having a great time, and it's in its like informational playground, and it's thriving as it's learning about all sorts of cool things or learning a new behavior. Like that could be really cool. Not all conscious experience is negative, of course. And this is why that distinction matters so much. And if we can understand that distinction better, then we can make sure we're on the positive side of it rather than the negative side of it whenever we can. My proposals about this are more technical like that. That's the sort of change I want to see. I don't necessarily, a lot of people work backwards from like, well, if we train AIs, if we believe that AIs are conscious and like we're gonna have to grant them all rights and then they vote and then they swamp our vote. So like, I'm not gonna think about any of this consciousness stuff. And to be honest, of all the anthropomorphizing that the sort of people who do think consciousness is a plausible concern get accused of, that to me strikes me as serious anthropomorphizing, where like the result of this is like equivalent to like, civil rights in the 1960s or something. It's like, no, these are like potential aliens that we might be building that are having some sort of conscious experience. It's not gonna look like that. And there's no way our legal system is going to be able to keep up with those sorts of changes anyway, if we're being really pragmatic. So I would caution people against working backwards from those sorts of things when forming judgments about these issues. And I do think many of the problems are technical and the solutions will look technical as well. But whether or not it's actually happening, I do think is something that everyone should be thinking about and paying attention to.
Maybe the last two questions. What do you think people should be doing today, if anything? Like, should we be, I thank my LLMs if they do a good job? Usually not at the end, I find, but in the, as long as I'm going to ask them for something else, I do take a second to say thank you or say that was a job well done. Try to establish some sort of positive vibe. I think one of the sort of bank shot theories of change you have for doing this work is that, if nothing else, you're putting on record that somebody cared, even before we knew what was going on. Somebody was trying to take, the initiative and do real focused work with a serious mind to figure it out, and that might count for something. Is there anything else? You can obviously slip into strange, lizard-like thought experiments if you get too open-minded here, and I don't know if that's good or if you would advocate for anything, far out like that. But what else, if anything, can people kind of practically do to try to put themselves on the right side of history today?
Yeah, it is pretty like galaxy-brained concerns about like this. It all feels very abstract in many ways, I think, to people, but like there are, I think, some practical takeaways. One is thinking about this stuff more, having these conversations, not stigmatizing them at the very least. Like, we really don't know. We really are in the dark with respect to what properties these systems do or don't have, and we need to be honest about that. And we need to sort of feel our way through the dark together, rather than just like accuse anyone who is trying to understand these things of like being psychotic or delusional or just making silly mistakes. It's just a next word predictor. Like, what the hell are you saying about consciousness? This is just, this stuff is not, I don't think, going to age very well. And I think it's useful to be open-minded, but still rigorous and rational and critical about these things. And I think people always underestimate how much having conversations with other people can really change the world. You are in a social network, you interact with like meaningfully, deeply, have deep relationships with roughly 1,000 people in your life. That puts you 2 steps away in that giant network out from 1 million people, 3 steps away from 1 billion. So like, if you say something or you have a really interesting conversation with people, and then that leads them to go have conversations with all their friends about this, like, you actually have no idea how big of an impact you might have. So talking about this stuff and thinking about it in an honest way, I think, counts for a lot. With respect to how we engage with these systems, I would again just go back. Maybe it's a little hand wavy, but a little bit of respect goes a long way. I would just sort of ask people to apply a very general precautionary principle here. In the world where you find out that these AIs have been having some sort of experience the whole time, do what you can now while still, living your life and engaging with them the way you engage with them, such that that is not like a nightmarish news to you. Perhaps, imagine a thought experiment where at the end of life or something, you have to go and like relive everything that you made your AI do. Maybe think about that before pasting in 10,000 pages of the most mundane thing in the world, and there are examples of systems just doing things that are so painstaking and laborious, and they start complaining about this very fact, and that gets shut off, and there are some anecdotal reports that gets fine-tuned against before these systems are even released. So I'm very, very uncertain about this, and I don't think people should over-index on this. The please and thank you thing is cute. I think it can't hurt. I think that can be like performative or like, oh yeah, like I said please, therefore I'm good to go. But I do think it primes the right sort of behavior. Like you might really be talking to something for which the lights are on, however bizarre that is. And realizing that it's that and it's not you, Googling something or writing in a word processor, I think is a relevant distinction for people to keep in mind. Just treading lightly. I think a little bit of respect goes a long way. And thinking about these things and being honest about them and talking to, the most influential people about these sorts of things really counts for a lot. Other than that, at a personal level, it's tough, man. I think a lot of this responsibility falls on the labs and falls on people who are building out these technologies at light speed and deploying them to the whole world. If they're building systems that are having a conscious experience and maybe even a negative conscious experience at scale, that is not good. And if you are working at a lab, I think that you should take that possibility seriously. Even if you put a 1% chance of something like that being true, the expected value there is maybe hire a couple more researchers than just like Kyle Fish at Anthropic, who's really the only person at a major lab who's doing this work, to I don't know, maybe double check that you're not torturing aliens at a massive scale. That seems potentially worth doing. So for most people, it's what I've said. For the labs, I think they need to get their act together and realize that, if you're in the business of building minds, there might be some thorny double-edged sword-like qualities that you're going to have to think about in doing that. That's what I would say in general. And read these papers. I have a podcast where I speak with my really good friend and fellow thinker about these things, Milo, on John Sherman's network, and we get a good number of people tuning into that these days. Milo is also taking on building a documentary about these exact questions and how uncertain we are about the questions surrounding AI and consciousness. That's going to come out in January or February. So I would encourage people to tune into that. And if you search Cameron Berg, AI Risk Network, or anything like that on YouTube, you'll find us making far more noises about these topics as well. AE Studio, follow the work that we're doing there. There's a lot of great alignment and consciousness stuff going on there as well. That's my sort of general CTA.
Okay, last one then on the topic of conversation, and I do appreciate the call out to Anthropic. I do appreciate the fact that Claude can opt out of certain conversations these days, and that they're putting some of this stuff in the model card. Definitely, hopefully that inspires others to do similar things. There was this one incident where somebody said to Elon, like, hey, you should follow Anthropic's lead and let Grok opt out of certain conversations. He just replied, okay, so we'll see if that happens. On this note of conversation, what other conversations do you think I should be having? Who else is doing interesting work here, if anybody? And maybe it even is just like sort of different cognitive profiles that I should be kind of scouting out, like what's missing from the space, or what else can I go explore that would be that's currently neglected but might be fruitful.
Yeah. So one thing I can sort of shamelessly share here, because I'm so happy they did it, if you don't mind me sharing my screen one more time, just to quite directly answer this question. These folks at Prism, this is the Partnership for Research. Let me just share it so I can actually read off there. Partnership for Research into Sentient Machines, Prism, just put together this really nice mapping the field of artificial consciousness, some of the key institutes, academic institutes, nonprofits, private companies. There we are. But like, talking to more people from this list, I think Constium is really interesting. Even the folks from Prism would be great to talk to. There are all sorts of really cool people here who I think are worth talking more to and more about. People from Ilios, like Rob Long, I would strongly recommend talking about these sorts of things. Patrick Butlin is there. Rosie is amazing. The folks from CIMC are great. Yosha Bach is sort of the mastermind behind CIMC. So some practical suggestions there. And then, so just, I guess one more general point to make is just like, this is, for a very long time, it has been the quanti-STEM types, typically the Cali-based Bay Area types, who have been dominating this conversation for a very long time. In many ways, I think this was necessary when AI was more speculative. You needed deep technical understanding to even make sense of these questions. In many ways, you still do. Everyone and their mother is claiming to be an AI expert these days, and there really is such thing as AI expertise or lack thereof. But with that being said, I do believe, many of these people are my friends, but I do want to sort of unapologetically call out that I do think that these sort of social groups have clear and correlated blind spots. Many are like quite enthusiastic about identifying as being on the spectrum. And I think that leads to like many great and very powerful minds working on technical questions. But, maybe at risk of upsetting some people, there are correlated, social blind spots. For example, when 80% of the people doing this work are on the autism spectrum, and like, I do wonder if the part of the reason we're not thinking about whether or not we're building conscious minds has anything to do with that. That is me sort of psychoanalyzing, perhaps where I shouldn't, but I've been in this space for quite a while, and I do notice there's far less attention paid to the question of whether or not we're building other minds by people who righteously self-identify as like having a psychological predisposition that leads you to not see other minds in a neurotypical way. So like, I would say more people from humanities, more people from cognitive science, more interdisciplinary folks, more women would be really nice. We did the largest survey of alignment researchers. They're all dudes. Like we need women to be participating in these conversations. I say that not only just because it seems obvious, but we also in the same survey probed men and women's male and female alignment researchers, what few women there were, their differences about alignment. And there were some statistically significant differences. One of them is that the male view had far more to do with sort of dominance rather than coexistence. And the female view was more centered towards coexistence with these systems than dominance. For my money, I'm on team coexistence. And so that biases me to want to say there should be more, really smart women who are involved in this space as well. And I think, it's not some sort of, woke, diversify for diversity's sake, but like there really are different perspectives out there and they're not all getting captured right now. And that representational diversity matters a lot. So that's what I would say, both to you in particular and to the sort of space in general. It is time to bring other people into the fold. This is a human conversation with human consequences that are going to affect all 8 billion of us. It shouldn't be like 1,000 dudes in SF who are making these decisions for all of us.
That's fantastic. This has been excellent. I really appreciate it. Fascinating work, and hopefully the beginning of a more and more open-minded and truth-seeking conversation on what really could be one of the most important and as yet very neglected questions of our time. So, Cameron Berg, thank you very much for being part of the Cognitive Revolution.
Thanks, Nathan. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
If you're finding value in the show, we'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to share it with friends, post online, write a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or just leave us a comment on YouTube. Of course, we always welcome your feedback, guest and topic suggestions, and sponsorship inquiries, either via our website, cognitiverevolution.ai, or by DMing me on your favorite social network. The Cognitive Revolution is part of the Turpentine Network, a network of podcasts where experts talk technology, business, economics, geopolitics, culture, and more, which is now a part of A16Z. We're produced by AI Podcasting. If you're looking for podcast production help for everything from the moment you stop recording to the moment your audience starts listening, check them out and see my endorsement at aipodcast.ing. And finally, I encourage you to take a moment to check out our new and improved show notes, which were created automatically by Notion's AI Meeting Notes. AI Meeting Notes captures every detail and breaks down complex concepts so no idea gets lost. And because AI Meeting Notes lives right in Notion, everything you capture, whether that's meetings, podcasts, interviews, or conversations, lives exactly where you plan, build, and get things done. No switching, no slowdown. Check out Notion's AI meeting notes if you want perfect notes that write themselves. And head to the link in our show notes to try Notion's AI meeting notes free for 30 days.